Labą dieną visiems susirinkusiems.
Good morning. My name is Rimas Magila. I am a head of technological department of the Lithuanian Agricultural Advisory Service. We are starting the conference, Healthy Soil for Healthy Crops. The healthy soil is very much related to the yield of plants, and our purpose is to hear the good practice from the international lecturers. And I hope that you will get the ideas about healthy soil and about the successful farming in the ever-changing agricultural and political environment. The conference is relevant as we see that participants' number increased above 1,000. This conference might be bravely said to be international, not only because of the international presenters, but also because of the international listeners. You can listen to the conference in two languages, English and Lithuanian. You can choose the preferred language by clicking the interpretation button. In the Q&A field, you can put your questions and we will try to answer them during the conference. If not, we will email you the answers after the conference. You will see all the questions on the screen, and if you want to support the question, please click like. The Lithuanian Agricultural Advisory Service is the organizer of this conference, and I will give the floor to the director of the service, Dr. Edvardas Makelis. Today, the Lithuanian Agricultural Advisory Service has a very important day. We are organizing one of the major conferences for scientists, consultants, and farmers. You all know that soil is the main tool for farmers, which is very important for the nutrition and healthy environment. The healthy soil theme and subject is very much discussed in the Green Deal and greenery context. So we all have to make efforts to make it work. I encourage you to share experience with colleagues from abroad. I'm very glad that more than 900 Lithuanian farmers have enlisted into this conference, and also we have international participants. Therefore, I might conclude that this conference is very much relevant. I hope that after the conference, we will get extremely well results in the farming and agriculture, which might help us to preserve soil for the future generation. Good luck to you all. Thank you very much. I will give the floor now to the main sponsor of the conference, and his representative, Romas Naudžiūnas. Good morning. I hope you hear me. Yes, we do. Our company is very proud to be a part of the Lithuanian agriculture for many years. As you know, agriculture has been, is, and will be the key industry sector in the world because it produces our food. And everything starts from the soil. Soil is the basis for the good agriculture. Our company, Vedestat, produces machinery and other components for agriculture, and we are the key sponsor of this conference. Our aim is to ensure the best results and benefits for all farmers. All the changes that are globally now present in agriculture encourages us to seek for new ways and new practices. Therefore, sharing of best practices is very important. And we are grateful to the advisory service and all the presenters for their share of the good practice. We are now celebrating 20 years celebration and 60-year celebration of the whole company. We have presented the key innovation proceed, which has contributed to agricultural best practices. Thank you for the floor. I also grateful for everyone for the continuous learning and letting us learn, and for the 20 years cooperation in Lithuania. Thank you very much. Thank you, Romas Naudžiūnas, for your greeting. I would also like to thank all the sponsors of the conference, which enabled you participants' participation in this conference free of charge. Informative sponsor is the journal My Farm. And now I will give the floor to the first presenter from the Netherlands, Arjen Reineveld, the head, and his topic is soil potential. Arjen, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this presentation. I'm very glad to see that there are so many people involved and who are interested. Very impressive that so many people will follow this 2 days of presentations. So thank you. My presentation will be about cation exchange capacity, something which you can measure in soil tests. And cation exchange capacity is very important because it's one of the first things which show you if you are using your soil in a correct way. So if you are getting to the soil potential if you will be able to get a high production of your fields. Because when you look at soil and soil fertility and soil health, when that's in an optimal status, it's more easy to get higher yields. So if you have a healthy soil, if you have a high soil fertility, it's easier to get a higher production, optimal production, and to an optimal crop quality. And when we look at soil health, it is chemical, physical, and biological soil health. So it's a combination of these things which show you if your soil is healthy. And when you look at the chemical component of soil fertility, it relates to, and I guess that's best known, it relates to main and micronutrients. So it's the nitrogen, it's the sulfur, it's the magnesium, the calcium, the potassium, of course, but it's also the micronutrients, and perhaps also some beneficial nutrients, which are very important. So that's the chemical soil health. And then, of course, also very important is the biological component of soil health, and that is the bacteria and the fungi and how active is your soil life in general, and that relates to many things as well. And then we've got the physical component, and that relates to soil texture, for example, clay, silt content, sand content of your soil, or it relates to soil structure, but it also relates to water holding capacity, for example. So the physical soil fertility is also very important, and one of the key aspects of soil physical fertility is cation exchange complex, and that will be the, like I mentioned, the topic of my presentation today. So it will be about the cation exchange complex, part of the physical soil fertility. And what we see worldwide is that when growers test their soil, most of the times it's very common, it's routine to test for phosphorus, potassium, and pH, and sometimes organic matter, and sometimes magnesium or copper, but that's it. And that limits the use of soil tests to optimize soil management and to get the optimal yield. So instead of only analyzing phosphorus and potassium, magnesium, and pH, Eurofins, where I'm working, wants to give farmers and growers and advisors, of course, information on a complete overview, if possible, of soil characteristics on a routine basis. So every soil sample which we analyze, we want to show what is the chemical, physical, and biological soil health. So cation exchange complex, finally, what is it? What is the cation exchange complex? Well, it's the clay-humus complex. That's also mentioned, but it relates to what is the soil able to bind nutrients, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and to supply those nutrients to the crop when the crop needs it. So it's the capacity of the soil to bind, to hold cations, and also to supply it again, because it's an exchange capacity. It can also bind other elements like aluminum or other elements which you most of the times don't want in your soil. Too much sodium, for example, as well. So you can say the cation exchange complex is kind of a storage for nutrients. And when you look at the two very different soils, when you've got a sandbox, when you've got a very, very, very sandy soil, the cation exchange complex will be 0 or almost 0. And when you've got a very heavy, organic rich, heavy textured, organic rich clay soil, then the cation exchange complex is very high, for example, 350 millimole per kilogram. So sandy soil has a very, very low cation exchange complex, and an organic matter rich, clay rich soil, a very high organic matter of a cation exchange complex. When you look at soils, I mean, I already showed you in the picture, there are differences between soil types, and you've got the sandy soils, generally low, clay, and the peat soil. So there are differences between soil types. However, there are also differences within soil types. So if you've got a sandy soil, you don't always have the same cation exchange complex. And when you've got a clay soil, you don't always have the same cation exchange complex. So differences, of course, between soils, but also within soils. So why? So before I will try to end this presentation by giving recommendations for farmers and advisors, but I will right now get a little bit in depth by explaining how is the cation exchange complex created. And when you look at how is the cation exchange complex built up, it depends on clay, on type of clay, and soil organic matter, and on some other aspects. I will first focus on the clay part of the effect of clay on the cation exchange complex. When we do a lot of samples at Eurofins, and when I look at all samples in our systems with the organic matter 2.2% as an example. So we do a lot of soil tests worldwide, and when I look at all the results of soil samples with the organic matter 2.2%, and pH of 5.6. So soils with organic matter 2.2 and pH 5.6. Then you can see that when you've got a higher clay percentage, the cation exchange complex increases. And when I do the same exercise for organic matter 2.2% and a pH 7.2, you see an even more clear relation. I mean, you can see that when the clay percentage increases, the cation exchange amount also increases. So even when you've got completely the same organic matter percentage and the same pH value, the clay percentage is very important for how high is your cation exchange complex. Okay, so the clay percentage is important, but also the type of clay. I won't go into detail, but when you look at the soil types, sand, clay, peat. When I focus on the clay part, and then I see as an example marine clay and riverine clay, so fluvial clay. You can see that also between clay soils there are differences, and that depends. That is because there are different types of clay. So a lot of clay types, the clay type will have an effect on how high is your cation exchange complex. But also the soil organic matter amount is very important for the cation exchange complex, even the most important. So when you look at this figure, again, I looked at all samples we have in our system in this example with clay content of less than 3%. So it's a very, very sandy soil. And the pH is 5.2. Then you can see that if soil organic matter increases, the cation exchange complex always increases as well. And when I do this same exercise for a clay percentage of more than 20%, and the pH value is 7.2, then again, organic matter, when it increases, cation exchange complex always increases as well. Then we've also when the pH is high, the oxides and the hydroxides effects. So that's mostly relevant when the pH is very high. But when I summarize this first part, you can see that the cation exchange complex is built up and is affected mainly by clay. If the clay content is higher, you will have a high binding capacity of nutrients. And when your soil organic matter is high, you will also have, in general, a more higher capacity to bind nutrients. So you could say, well, you can't change your clay content overnight, perhaps never, but you can't change your organic matter content very easily, at least not within a year or 2 years. So you could conclude, nice that you measure cation exchange complex, but nothing can be changed. If that's the situation, this perhaps would be the end of my presentation. However, there is something which can be changed, and I will show you that in this figure. When I look at all the results in our system, all the soil samples we've got, and with a clay content of less than 4%, so it's a sandy soil, and then the organic matter is 2.3%. So it's all the same organic matter, same clay percentage. So the clay and organic matter effect is not there anymore. Then you can see that when you pH, and we didn't discuss that yet, when you pH increases, your cation exchange complex always increases as well. So pH is also very important for the cation exchange complex. Another example, it shows the same. So how is the cation exchange complex built up? When the pH increases, the effective cation exchange complex, so the cation exchange complex increases as well. And the yellow line is the total cation exchange complex. This is an example, of course, how it works. And then you can see that the clay percentage is important, but the clay content has an effect on the cation exchange complex, which is less than the organic matter content. So if you improve your pH, if you improve your pH content of your soil, the effective cation exchange complex will increase. So pH value is very important for your cation exchange complex. Okay, so this is the general overview, and then what is bound at the cation exchange complex. And when you look at it, and you look at it from when you would be able to look in the soil, you would be seeing something like this. You've got the crop with the clay particles and the sand particles, and then it's the clay humus complex or the cation exchange complex. And then when you focus get a little bit closer, you can see that there will be potassium, calcium, sodium, perhaps aluminum, calcium, and other cations bound at the cation exchange complex. And on average, you can see that most of the soils have most calcium bound at the cation exchange complex. So on average, we find 75% calcium at the cation exchange complex, but there's of course a very wide range between 30 and almost 100% of calcium at the cation exchange complex. Sodium is fortunately often a lot lower, because if it's too much, you've got a very salty, saline soil. Potassium ranges very much between almost nothing to 20% of potassium at the cation exchange complex. So you can imagine that what is at the cation exchange complex, which nutrients, can be very important for your crop. So, and I won't be testing you at the end of this part of my presentation, but you can make some calculations. And when you've got a report, we measure pH and we measure the cation exchange complex, and we do that again when it's a little bit higher pH, and then you can see that you've got a higher cation exchange complex. But when I compare two situations, the first situation is that you've got a cation exchange complex of 50, and that will be a sandy soil. Then when you use the average amount of cations at the cation exchange complex, it is 300 kilogram potassium per hectare. So if you have a very, very sandy soil with a cation exchange complex of 50, you have 300 kilogram of potassium stored, bound in your soil, which is of course not nothing. And then you've got 200 kilogram of magnesium and 2,500 kilogram of calcium per hectare. So that is in store on your average when you've got a cation exchange complex of 50. When your cation exchange complex, your clay humus complex, is a little higher, it's 80 in this situation, and it's again a sandy soil, and the amount in storage will then be 450 kilogram of potassium per hectare, and 300 kilogram of magnesium per hectare, and 3,500 kilogram of calcium per hectare. Meaning that if you have a little higher cation exchange complex from 50 to 80, you will have 150 kilogram potassium more per hectare, 100 kilogram of magnesium more, and even 1,000 kilogram of calcium potentially in your soil. So, of course, you can see that if it's higher, your efficiency of fertilizer use is much higher because the soil will be able to bind nutrients. And then, again, an example on a sandy soil, example, no clay, organic matter, the same content. And then you can see again that when your pH increases, you will have a higher cation exchange capacity. And if you improve your pH from 5 to 5.5, so only from 5 to 5.5, you can see that you will improve or increase the amount of potassium which is stored at your cation exchange complex increases very clearly. And of course, it's very important if you have 200 kilogram almost of potassium more in your soil, it will also be, the soil will also be able to supply that to your crops. And when we dig into literature and we look at research, we will find many articles, a lot of information about cation exchange complex and yield and crop quality and so on. But and that's interesting and important. However, we also always like to do our own tests, small demonstration studies for farmers, for growers, for advisors. And this is a small example, a demonstration study. We had on a dairy farm, we had grassland, we had corn, maize, and then you can see that if your cation exchange complex is a little higher, it was very low, it was sometimes even only 20. And when you could improve that cation exchange complex, you can see that in all situations, your yield potential, your yield also improved clearly. That was also the situation when you have when you have an improved cation exchange complex. It is easier to get more crude protein, nitrogen, in your crop. How's that? I mean, when you've got a higher cation exchange complex, how do you get more nitrogen in your crop? And that is, of course, because there's a relation between the cations like magnesium and calcium and potassium and the uptake of nitrogen. If you've got an improved amount of calcium, potassium, magnesium, it is easier for the crop also to take up the nitrogen, which is supplied, which is available in the soil. And then the uptake of nitrogen is higher, and the crude protein content of, for example, grass will also be higher. But we also did a very nice trial, several years, several locations, several repeatments at a farm-fried farm in the north of Poland, sandy soil. And then we looked at potato. Of course, it's a crop rotation. And then we looked at potato, rapeseed, and winter wheat. And again, we found that when the cation exchange complex is a little higher, it's easier to obtain higher yields. But we also found something else. I mean, I was showing that the cation exchange complex has a relation with the yields potential, with the quality, the uptake of nutrients, but it's also related, and you can say I could say to efficient use of nutrients, to prudent use of nutrients, but I can also say it relates to money, because you can make the right decisions as a farmer, as an advisor, when you've got more knowledge of your soil. And that's what happened here. it was the north of Poland. Sandy soil, and the farmers used to give actually 300 kilogram in the past, and they already lowered it a little bit to 200 kilogram of potassium per hectare. So the normal practice of this farm, very big farm, was to give 200 kilogram of potassium per hectare. And that was based on the knowledge that the available potassium was low. So they did a soil test. They were used to do those soil tests. And then they could see that the amount of plant available potassium was low. So the 200 kilogram seemed logical. However, they started working with more characteristics of soil tests, and they found out that the potassium at the cation exchange complex, so the amount of potassium at the cation exchange complex was high. So they had low availability, so low direct availability of potassium, but they had a high amount of potassium in storage. In the binding capacity and also the supplying capacity was high. So they were surprised and a little bit amazed. And of course, it's perhaps not a surprise because they used to give a lot of potassium, 300 kilogram in the past, and in the last years, 200 kilogram of potassium per hectare. So the amount of potassium at the cation exchange complex had built up. You can also make it like a picture. The availability of potassium was low, so it's normal to give 200 kilogram of potassium per hectare as a recommendation and as a fertilizer use. So high application, and then they didn't know at the time, but that's what we found out together, was that the cation exchange complex was good, high even. So the soil was able to supply potassium throughout the growing season. And then the question was, is the 200 kilogram really needed? Can we give perhaps 150 or 100 or even 50 kilogram of potassium per hectare, while of course maintaining the same quality? It's very important for potato, the same yield, of course. Will a lower application of potassium have an effect on yield or quality? And then we did treatments, several years, several places. And then we found that when we lowered the amount of potassium application from 200 to 100 or even 50, but then we didn't dare that, even to 100, we found the same yield, the same crop quality. However, of course, it's not for free potassium, and in this situation, we could then, instead of 200, use 100 kilogram of potassium per hectare. So we saved also 100 kilogram of potassium per hectare. And since this was a very big farm, or in my opinion, in my eyes, a rather big farm, we had 1,000 hectares, and then we saved a tremendous lot of money on the cost of potassium. And I'm not saying that you should always lower the amount of potassium, because I've always also seen that when your soil fertility is not in an optimal shape, your yield potential is lower. So when this is the situation, you've got a low amount of available potassium, and you also have a low cation exchange complex, or at least potassium at the cation exchange complex. In this situation, of course, you need to give an additional amount of potassium sometimes to improve your soil fertility, soil health status. But this was nice that we could save so much money, and the farmer and the managing director there was very happy with this result. Okay. See, a cation exchange complex is also important for some other aspects. I related it to yield, I related it to crop quality and to efficient use of nutrients, money, but also it has a relation with the soil structure, especially on clayey soils. When you've got, this is the reference soil, it's not a very good soil structure. And when you add calcium and the amount of calcium at the cation exchange complex increases, you will have the same soil, but then with a much better soil structure. So calcium also relates, and calcium at the cation exchange complex also relates to soil structure. So how to improve your cation exchange complex then? You could see that pH is very important. When the pH value is too low, you can of course lime, and that will improve your effective cation exchange complex. So the amount of cations which can be bound, and that will of course have an effect on the magnesium, calcium, and potassium amount at your cation exchange complex. So if you improve soil health, improve your yield potential, it is important to first lime, and only after that you can improve by adding manure, compost, or fertilizer to improve your magnesium, calcium, and potassium status.
Konferencija metų.
I didn't understand that, but I guess my time is running out. Organic matter can improve your cation exchange complex in the total amount of your cation exchange complex. And of course, that's compost, manure, crop residues, green fertilizer. That will all improve your organic matter content, and with that, the cation exchange complex. And after you've done that, you can also, of course, give fertilizer, and that will improve your nutrient status. Well, this is a calculation in detail, which I won't discuss. You can look at it if you want to. This is how we calculate with the cation exchange complex. And it's important to know that not all nutrients are bound with the same efficiency at the cation exchange complex. Sodium, for example, or potassium are less effectively bound at the cation exchange complex compared to calcium and magnesium. So how do we measure it? I saw in the introduction movie, I saw the NER system, and a lot of cation exchange complex measurements are measured with the NER system. So we measure with light, like many things are measured with light. And we've written that down in an article as well. So, almost finished. We want to show the farmer and the advisor and the grower that there's more than only a few nutrients important, but we would like to offer on a routine basis a lot of information. And then one of the most important soil characteristics is the cation exchange complex, which will show you if the soil will be able to bind nutrients, to store nutrients, and it depends on the clay content, organic matter, and pH value for the effective cation exchange complex. So is it an important? I think yes, but you already found that out. It's an indicator for yield potential, crop quality, soil structure, and of course the efficient use of nutrients. So you can improve that, and and use your soil health in an optimal way. And it's a little bit too early, I guess, for this, but thank you for your attention.
Taip, dėkui gerbiamam Arjan Reinevelt ir turime keletą klausimų. Ir pirmas klausimas, kas pas mus Lietuvoje atlieka tokius tyrimus ir parengia rekomendacijas? Klausimas būtų, ar gali ūkininkai patys išsityrę maisto medžiagų kiekis pasiskaičiuoti kationų mainų geba dirvožemį?
Thank you. Very nice question, of course. We work in close collaboration with the organization of this conference, and they are able to measure it and offer it to the farmer. So in every soil test which they do, it's of course their decision, but we measure it and they can use it. So the cation exchange complex, the calcium, the potassium, the magnesium, but also the sodium are analyzed at the cation exchange complex on a routine basis in Lithuania itself.
Taip, mes Lietuvos žemės ūkio konsultavimo tarnyba, turiu pasakyti, bendradarbiaujam su Eurofins kompanija ir tikimės greitų laikų galėsime ūkininkams pasiūlyti šitą paslaugą, ištirti būtent kartu su kitomis maisto medžiagomis jų dirvožemius ir taip pat kationų mainų gebą. Kitas klausimas, kurį mes turime. Koks jūsų požiūris į probiotikų panaudojimą dirvožemyje?
Thank you for this question again. It's not completely related to this topic, I guess, but it's an interesting question. I think there are a lot of ways to improve to make sure that you use soil health in an efficient way, and that includes looking at the total package. So I guess it's the best for one of the questions for one of the other speakers, because they will explain a little bit more in detail.
Taip, kadangi mes turėsime rytoj.
Yes, tomorrow we will have, during the second day of the conference, we'll talk about the biology of the soil, and should we have similar questions, we hope to get answers to questions like this one. Another question, could you please comment on the cation exchange capacity and the distribution of fungi in the, what is the relationship between fungi and cation exchange capacity?
Thank you. When you look at it relates to in many ways. When you look at how cation exchange complex is built up, it's built up among others by organic matter, and of course the fungi are very much related to organic matter as well. So if the fungi will be able to, for example, supply a little bit more of phosphorus because of what they are, how they work in the soil, the phosphorus uptake will also be more efficient by the combination of fungi and a higher cation exchange complex, because then the phosphorus will be taken up by together with nutrients like calcium and potassium and magnesium. So again, the interaction between cations and anions, and in this situation related to fungi, is a very important one.
Taip, dėkui. Taip pat klausimas.
Yes, thank you. You talked about liming, and the question is about that. Would the use of lime contribute to the green gas emissions and CO2 emissions? That's a question, a comment of some sort. Could you comment back?
I guess the question is focusing on the part that if you give too much lime at once, there will be too much activity and oxygen in the soil, which will burn organic matter, which will contribute to climate warming. So don't give too much lime at once. Small amounts every year would be much better if needed to improve the cation exchange complex and your pH. And if you give too much, it will not be efficient, and it will perhaps have a negative effect on the climate. However, the other way, when you look at the other way around, if you make the soil more efficient, more nutrients bound at the cation exchange complex, because your pH is higher, you've given a little lime, then there also will be more crop development, crop residues, root development, and that will be an input of organic matter and a binding of carbon, and so it will be have a positive effect on the carbon sequestration in your soil. So the answer in short will be: don't supply too much lime at once, but try to give, if possible, every year a little.
Dėkoju. Dar vienas klausimas. Jeigu kalio prieinamumas.
One more question. If the availability of potassium is very low and the CC potassium amount is high, can we see it as the major part of potassium is related to the mineral surface of the soil and will not be available for crops? Is it correct? Can we understand it like this? And in that case, how can we make potassium available for crops in that case?
Well, for potassium is mainly bound at the cation exchange complex, and in the name exchange complex, it is also included that the soil will be able to supply it to the crop. So it's not bound in a way that it's not able for the crop. So if you've got a high potassium amount at the cation exchange complex, the soil will be able to supply that to the crop. So if you've got, like I showed in the trial, if you've got a relatively low amount available, but if you've got a high amount at the cation exchange complex, then that cation exchange complex will be able to supply a little every day of the year, every day of the growing season. So it supplies little, and in the end, that's a lot.
Taip. Dėkui.
Thank you very much. Another question is about how important is the tillage way for the amount of CC?
Thank you. Everything which makes sure that the organic matter is not lost, but is remained in the soil. So every kind of tillage which improve carbon storage, organic matter increase perhaps, will have a positive effect on the cation exchange complex. And every tillage, every measurement, deep plowing, very intensive cultivations, everything which will have a negative effect on organic matter will also have a negative effect on the cation exchange complex, the efficient cation exchange complex. So everything which you can do to improve organic matter build-up will have a very, very positive effect on your, well, in the end, on your potential yield.
Dėkui. Dar turime klausimą.
Thank you. One more question. What is the alternative for lime to improve the pH level?
Well, I don't know. Perhaps normally when the pH is low, you need kind of products which are improve your, which bind your amount of H plus in the soil and the amount. So you need something like lime. Only when the pH is higher, you need products which don't improve pH, but still supply calcium or magnesium. So I don't know. Normally you would always use lime, and that's the general term for that.
Thank you. We still have some time left and some questions left.
Perfect.
How important is the amount of humus in the soil for the CC?
Interesting question, because it relates a little bit to the definition of humus. I would normally say that the stable amount of carbon within organic matter is humus. You can have some discussions about that. But of course, the amount of humus is very important. When it's higher, you've got a higher cation exchange, because I also mentioned that the cation exchange complex can also be called clay humus complex. So humus is already part of the name of clay humus complex. So if you have a higher amount of humus, you will have a higher amount of binding of nutrients. Perhaps it's also good to mention that sometimes when you've got very peaty soils with a lot of humus, pH tends to be very low, and then also other elements like aluminum or cadmium or manganese can be at the cation exchange complex, and that can have very negative effects on, for example, root development, because it then becomes toxic. So the amount of those elements. So when you've got a very, very high amount of humus, it also often relates to lower pH values. So you should have a very careful look if you've got a very high amount of humus, if your pH is not too low. And again, of course, it's not sensible to give too much lime to improve the amount of your pH value if you've got a high amount of humus.
Dėkui. Dar keletą klausimų.
Thank you. Still several questions on the go.
Perfect.
Have you only tested phosphorus and potassium, which are available for crops, but also testing other elements that are not available? Also, we have another question: how to release phosphorus from the soil?
Okay. Well, actually, I'm very glad that you asked me this question, because I didn't want to go into all those details in my presentation. But when we measure the soil, we always try to measure at least the availability of nutrients, so the availability of nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, potassium, but also the micronutrients, beneficial nutrients. So that's one part. But the other part is that we want to measure what is the amount in storage, in stock. And from a scientific point of view, that is called the intensity, buffering capacity, and quantity concept. But for a farmer, we want to show what is available, what is in stock. And when you look at calcium, we also sometimes look what is the total amount in stock. So we always try to analyze availability in addition to storage of nutrients in every soil test. So very good question and very important, because it's not only important for potassium, like I showed you in the trial, but it's also important for other nutrients like calcium, like magnesium, like phosphorus as well. And when I may answer the phosphorus question, if there's time for that, there was a question how to make sure that you use the phosphorus in the soil in an optimal way. I think that was the question. And then there can be a total presentation about this, but I think when you relate it to the cation exchange complex, it is very good to look at how much, if you've got an optimal amount of cations in the soil and an optimal soil structure, then it's much easier for the crop to take up the forage of the phosphorus, which is in storage. So if you have an optimal soil structure, then the root development is optimal, and then phosphorus can be taken up more easy. And if you make sure that none of the other nutrients is the weakest link, so not potassium, not calcium, not magnesium, but also, of course, not nitrogen and sulfur. If you've got those nutrients all in a perfect amount, then the phosphorus is taken up most efficient, and the growth will increase. And of course, it's also important to say that if you add too much of gypsum or lime at once, then there's too much calcium, and that will bind with the phosphorus and will decrease the amount of phosphorus in the which is available for the crop. So you always should try to look at the optimal situation. Enough nutrients. Don't want any nutrients to be the weakest link. Perfect soil structure, so root development is perfect. But also look at how much of a improvement amount of lime or gypsum do you give. Don't give too much, so it will have negative effects.
Dėkoju. Dar porą klausimų.
Thank you. Still a couple of questions for you. Is there any optimum relationship between cations identified in percentage?
Again, good question. But if you only look at the optimal amount percentage at the cation exchange complex, you miss one thing. If you, for example, have the optimal amount of calcium and potassium and magnesium at the cation exchange complex, the optimal ratio, but you've got a very low amount of cation exchange complex, then it can be an optimal ratio, but the absolute, the quantity is still very low for the crop. So the ratio can be perfect, but the quantity can be terrible. In the other way, but when you also, for another, so that's not only the ratio is important, it's also how much plant available is there. So it's the combination, what is plant available, and the amount at the cation exchange complex. For example, also, when you've got a high amount of high pH soil, and when you've got 7.5, for example, or 7, and when you look at the calcium amount, for example, there can be an optimal range at the cation exchange complex, but the availability can be low because the pH is too high, which also can be the situation. So we never look only at the ratio at the cation exchange complex, which some researchers, some institutes do. We always look at what's the ratio in addition to what is plant available. And like I said, it's the concept of science of the intensity, buffering capacity, and quantity concept, which we follow at Eurofins, and this is the combination of both. So never only look at the ratio itself, always look at the amount of plant available as well. Long answer.
Ačiū labai. Ačiū labai.
Thank you very much. There are still more questions, but they are more related to humus and fulvic acids, which will be discussed tomorrow. And all the questions that are left unanswered now, we will answer later. Now we will have a 15-minute break, and after 15 minutes, we will continue with our conference.
Tęsime mūsų konferenciją. Kviečiu.
We are continuing with our conference, and I will give the floor to Professor Bradley, Roger Sylvester Bradley, who is Head of Crop Performance at the LAAS UK. He is also Honor Professor at Nottingham University, and his topic is optimizing fertilization of winter wheat. Mr. Bradley, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Taip, mes jūs girdim puikiai.
That's good.
Galite.
That's good, thank you. So, well, this is a great pleasure, and I would like to thank all the organizers and reamers who we've got to know over the last year or so for this invitation to speak to so many of you. I just moved house, and I now realize I am living at the same latitude as Lithuania. So I have moved from east of England to Scotland. But I have spent most of my career, and I did my first nutrition experiments 50 years ago, exactly 50 years ago. I have spent my career researching crop nutrition, and particularly wheat nutrition. So I have, in the next hour or a bit less than an hour, I have the job of summarizing 50 years of what I have learned. And that is not an easy job. And I still do not have all the answers. But what I'm going to talk about is, first of all, the crop and how the crop grows and how nutrients influence the growth of the crop, and which nutrients we are particularly concerned about. And then I will move to I will focus mainly on nitrogen nutrition, because nitrogen is the most expensive nutrient on a farm, and also it is the most limiting nutrient. And then I will talk about the importance of monitoring. We have just had an excellent talk about measuring the soil. Well, I am very much persuaded that it's important to measure in order for you to manage and optimize your nutrition. It is going to be very important for you to measure what is happening on your farm. There are two publications that if you can read English, then these two publications should be very helpful. They're available from our AHDB website. AHDB is our growers levy organization, so they support the research that we do. So I'm going to start by thinking about the crop and how the crop grows. And this document is the guide that we have produced for our farmers about how the crop grows. We first published this guide about 25 years ago. And we have always had the ambition of not having a guide, but actually having a dashboard just like driving a car. What we would really like is for you to be able to monitor what is happening on your farm day by day, week by week, so that you can manage it better. So we have this dream, and we're still working on developing this, of you being able to measure, estimate your growth of your crop in order that you can manage it better. Of course, the most important thing that governs the growth of your crop is solar radiation, is the solar energy. And you see the cloud on the top left of the picture. When that cloud comes across the field...
Atsiprašau, gerbiamas Rodžeri, mes nematome skaidrių. Mes matome jūs, bet nematome skaidrių. Jūs pasidalinkite ekranu.
I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. Okay. So now let me arrange my screen. So the three topics are wheat yield formation, and then nitrogen management, and then monitoring the success of your crop nutrition. So those are my three topics. And I was talking about the monitoring the growth of this field of wheat and the importance of understanding the process. In order that you can manage the process, you have to understand the process. And 25 years ago, we produced this booklet that describes how to think about the formation of yield. But now we have the dream of having a dashboard, and the dashboard would tell us about the growth of the crop, and particularly the importance of the solar energy that the crop is capturing. Because the job of the crop is to convert that solar energy into edible energy. But also there is the importance of the availability of water, because the crop needs water to cool its leaves, because half of the energy is not photosynthetically active. That energy will cause the crop to heat up. And if it doesn't have water, it will heat up and not be able to grow any further. So, and then thermal time is important in governing the development of the crop. So the duration of each of the production phases of the crop. But then we have 12 essential nutrients. And Arjen just talked about the nutrients. What I've got them as buttons here. The 6 on the left are the major nutrients, and the 6 on the right are the micronutrients. And I will talk about those in more detail in a moment. But the important thing in optimizing the nutrients is to understand the role of the nutrients. So the nutrients are important in converting the solar energy by intercepting the solar energy into edible energy. So the simplest summary of what we do in farming is that we harvest energy. So it's very important in optimizing to understand what the benefit of the extra nutrients that we provide might be in generating that edible energy. And these are the 12 essential nutrients, of which 3, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, are generally the most limiting. I'm sorry, I was just... And we understand the nutrients as just one of the nutrients may be the most limiting. And in fact, in the UK, most recently, we've been finding that phosphorus is generally the most limiting nutrient. Of course, nitrogen is important, and the growers understand that, but we have a particular problem with phosphorus nutrition, as I will show you later in the talk. So let us think about the soil. Aryan earlier in the morning has been talking about the soil, but from a crop scientist point of view, the importance of how we judge the performance of the soil is in the continuity of the supplies that the soil provides, not only of nutrients, but also of water. So the nutrients generally come almost entirely from the topsoil, and that's what Aryan was focusing on, but the water comes predominantly from the subsoil. The quantity of water held by the soil is similar all the way down and depends very much on the soil texture and on the stone content and on whether there are any rock down below. But the nutrients come mainly from the topsoil. So I'm going to focus now on the nutrients that come from the topsoil. So these are the 12 essential nutrients. And as you can see in the diagram, I have shown them on a logarithmic scale because they're needed in very different quantities. So nitrogen and potassium are needed in hundreds of kilograms per hectare. Phosphorus, magnesium, sulfur are needed in tens of kilograms per hectare. And boron and manganese and zinc and copper are needed in hundreds of grams per hectare, whereas molybdenum is only needed in single grams per hectare. So very different quantities, but any of those nutrients may be limiting. And it's important for us to try to understand which of them is most limiting and focus on them. But generally it is the nitrogen that is most limiting. Sometimes it's potassium. And as I said, in the UK, it's often phosphorus as well. But I'm going to focus now on nitrogen management. And for this, we have a booklet that's also available from the AHDB website that describes how to estimate and optimize nitrogen use for winter wheat. And I'm going to try to summarize what it says in that booklet, which is about 20 pages. The approach taken in that booklet is that we try to calculate a balance, and I will explain that in a minute. But we also have to admit that when we make our estimates of what the crop needs, that these are subject to considerable uncertainties. So that it's very important to monitor whether you've been successful or not, because there are carryover effects of making mistakes. So if you under-fertilize, then the soil becomes depleted of nitrogen, and if you over-fertilize, the soil becomes to contain more nitrogen, which means that the following crop won't need so much. They're small effects with nitrogen. Of course, they're bigger with phosphorus and potassium, but with nitrogen, those effects still apply in the UK conditions. So let's look at the calculations that the booklet helps us to make. And we start by trying to estimate how much nitrogen the crop is going to need. And nitrogen and the other nutrients are largely needed in proportion to the area, the green area of the crop's canopy. So that for a wheat crop, it needs about 30 kilograms of nitrogen for every hectare of green canopy. So we can estimate the canopy nitrogen requirement. And for example, if we say that the canopy needs to be 6 hectares of green per hectare of ground, then the crop needs 180 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. But for higher yielding crops, the crops yielding more than about 9 tons per hectare, then the grain will actually need more nitrogen than the canopy. So we need to make an estimate by multiplying the grain yield by the grain's nitrogen concentration. But that's how we estimate the crop nitrogen demand. And then we have to estimate how much nitrogen will become available from the soil. Now, this can be measured, but it's quite laborious and expensive to measure. So generally in the UK, we have tables which are lookup tables which estimate the effects of all the processes that are going on in the soil that cause release and immobilization of nitrogen and loss of nitrogen. So the factors are what the previous crop was and what the soil type is and how much rainfall there is over winter. And we have lookup tables that help us to estimate how much nitrogen the crop will get from the soil. And then there's, as you can see, there is a gap. Generally, there is a deficiency between what the crop needs and what the soil provides, and that has to be provided by fertilizer or manure. And the fertilizer is not, I'm afraid, 100% efficient. In fact, I don't know any fertilizer or any nutrient that is 100% efficient. If you're using, in the UK, we generally have a choice between ammonium nitrate and urea. Some people use liquid fertilizers, which are a combination of ammonium nitrate and urea. And there are other products, of course, and of course we have a lot of livestock, so we have animal manures as well. But if we just consider urea, if it's not inhibited, so you can add an inhibitor to stop this happening, but urea generally, when it is applied to the soil, loses some nitrogen as ammonia to the atmosphere, and that generally is about 10%. The rest of the nitrogen and ammonium nitrate loses very little ammonia to the atmosphere, but both ammonium nitrate and urea are only about 60% efficient, but that number is very variable. So about 30 or 40 or maybe even more is immobilized in the soil by the soil biology. So the fungi and the bacteria and all the earthworms have something to need that nitrogen, and your fertilizer, unfortunately, gets locked up by them in the soil. So not all soil biology is good. That's soil biology, when it comes to fertilizing with nitrogen, actually locks up some of your nitrogen. So now you can see the 3 components of the nitrogen balance. and here is the calculation, the balance calculation that we do. So the amount of fertilizer nitrogen that's needed is equal to the soil nitrogen supply subtracted from, the soil nitrogen supply subtracted from the crop demand and divided by the fertilizer recovery. And as I say, the fertilizer recovery tends to be better for ammonium nitrate than urea, and it tends to be better on sandy soils than on chalky soils, or indeed on clay soils. And clay soils are slightly better than chalky soils. So just to give you some examples of some typical figures for crops in the UK, the predicted crop demand might be 225. The predicted soil supply might be 110, leaving 115 kilograms needed from fertilizer. The fertilizer might be 60% efficient, which means that when you subtract 110 from 225 divided by 60%, you get 190 kilograms per hectare of fertilizer nitrogen, and that becomes the amount to apply. However, there's a very important, what I've told you about now is the biology of the system, but now we need to think economically, because what you have to pay for all that fertilizer. And in fact, this year you're paying a lot more for that fertilizer, I believe, than you have previously paid. So we need to think how to optimize that. And in any investment decision, you need to look at the incremental effects of extra investment on the extra return. So that's what I'm going to look at now. What this means is that basically, as you apply more nitrogen, the crop has a bigger and bigger canopy, and the energy it captures increases, but it increases less and less. So at some point, there is an optimum size of canopy. Now, I suggested it might be about 6, and that's generally what we have found in the UK, a canopy of 6, so that's 6 hectares of green tissue per hectare of ground. But that changes according to the price of the grain that you're going to get back from the canopy and the price of the fertilizer that you invest in the canopy. So I'm going to summarize all that in terms of grain yield and nitrogen applied. So along the bottom here, I have an increasing amounts of nitrogen applied. And on the left-hand side, I have from bottom to top, I have increasing grain yield. And when we do an experiment with different levels of fertilizer nitrogen, we see these rapid increases from about 5 tons, something like that, with no fertilizer at all. So that's what the soil is providing. The soil nitrogen is providing. But then we have, for the next 75 kilograms of nitrogen, we have about 3 tons of grain. So that's a huge return on the first level investment. Then on the next 75 kilograms up to 150, we have another a bit less than 2 tons per hectare. So that is also very profitable. But then we start seeing much smaller increases, only about half a ton for the next 60 kilograms. And then the grain yield starts decreasing. So what we, in order to come up with guidance for farmers, we fit a curve and we find the optimum, which is indicated by the triangle of this on this diagram. And that triangle is the optimum when it takes 5 kilograms of grain to pay for 1 kilogram of fertilizer nitrogen. And that has been the situation for the last 15 years. But in the last year, the prices of the relative prices of nitrogen and grain have changed so that it now takes 10 kilograms of grain to pay for a kilogram of nitrogen. So the optimum has decreased by about 50 kilograms per hectare. And that means that the optimum size of the canopy has decreased by about 1 hectare. So the optimum size of the canopy has come down from about 6.5 to about 5.5. Now, I've said the importance of monitoring, and one of the very useful aspects of the analysis that we can do of the crop is that the grain protein changes much more than the grain yield as we adjust nitrogen quantities in the region of the optimum. So that you can see that at 5:1, we have a grain protein of just over 11%. And at 10:1, we have a grain protein of about 10%. So the grain protein, the optimum grain protein has come down by about 1% due to the change in the prices of fertilizer. Now that's all very well, and that's I hope easy to understand. But now we come into the difficult area of variability. we have huge variability in farming. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that, but somehow we have to think of a way of managing that variability. And the answer, as I will come to at the end of the talk, is all to do with measurements on the farm. So that was one experiment that taken from this series of experiments that we did about 15 years ago. So there are 57 response experiments here, and you can see that there are about 10% of them have an optimum indicated by the triangle that is very near zero. So there is absolutely no increase in yield from any application of fertilizer nitrogen. And conversely, there are 10% of the experiments showed an optimum greater than 300 kilograms per hectare. And these were all fields on farms where we expected there to be a response to fertilizer nitrogen. And so how do we cope with all that variability? Well, the most important thing that explains it is the amount of nitrogen coming from the soil. So if we replot the same graphs, but instead of just having the fertilizer nitrogen along the bottom of the diagram, we have the soil nitrogen as well as the fertilizer nitrogen. We estimated the soil nitrogen from the uptake by the crop. You'll see that the curves become much better reconciled. The initial increases are all very similar, but the ultimate, the plateau are all quite different. So we need to think about what is governing the variation in yield. And as you can see, but because the curves are flat, you can see that nitrogen is actually not having a big influence on yield in the region of the optimum. So if you were worried about reducing the amount of nitrogen due to the higher prices, actually the quantity of yield that you'll be losing by coming down by 50 kilograms per hectare is only about 0.3 of a ton per hectare. But nevertheless, there is huge variation between fields, and there is a slight positive trend between the optima and the level of yield on that field. But most of the variation between these experiments was not explained by the amount of nitrogen applied. It's explained by other factors that are to do with the farm and to do with the field. So I now want to think about this variation, because we've been studying the variation a lot in recent years, and we've come to the conclusion that it clearly is something that we've got to address. However, the focus in farming has because of the technology has become available, has been about varying applications within a field. I would like to persuade you that the first thing you need to think about is the biggest area, and then home in down until you get to the variation within the field. So the first thing you need to think about is the country or the region as a whole, and whether the levels of nitrogen generally shown in experiments are high or low for that part of the world. And then we come down to the more local area, and ultimately we come down to the farm. And we again and again now have been finding how different farms are. So the amounts of nitrogen needed on each farm are different. And the amounts needed within the farm on each field are different. And of course, because the farm has a much bigger area than the small zones within a field, then the impact of the decisions you make on the farm are much more important than the impacts of the decisions that you make by automatically altering the amounts of nitrogen within a field. Now, just to show you this sort of what we've the sort of work we've been doing to show us illustrate this, I want to show some work we've been doing with on-farm testing. And in fact, this paper has just been published in Nature Food, which is showing how on-farm experimentation we see as being a really important way forward to try and understand these differences between farms, differences between fields. So that's what I'm going to show you now. We've produced a guide for farmers to help do these trials. If you're interested in doing these trials, you can find the guidebook on our YEN website, and I'm going to talk about YEN in a talk later today. So the project I'm going to talk about we called LEARN, and it involved a group of farmers, 18 farmers, that we formed into what we call a farm innovation group, or a FIG. And those farmers obviously were all interested in studying the amounts of nitrogen that they were going to apply. And they all did an experiment like this. So they had their standard level of nitrogen, which was 220 kilograms per hectare in this particular example, but different farms had different strategies. And then they each did a tram line with 60 kilograms less, so 160, or 60 kilograms more, so 280. And then they measured the yield with their mapping combine harvesters. And they did this on 3 fields each year for 4 years. So with 18 farms, we had a huge set of data, and we were able to make many possible comparisons, looking at within the field, at the subzones, at the fields, at the farms, at the regions, and across the seasons. And there's a huge story to tell here, and I don't have time to tell it all, but what I want to show you to start with is the responses to nitrogen that we got. So along the bottom, we have the variation in nitrogen applied on each of the farms. We have on the left, the grain yields, and you can see approximately 150 responses to fertilizer nitrogen. And you can see how flat the responses are. So this changing by 60 kilograms more and 60 kilograms less is having a very small effect on yield. But the variation in yield is enormous. The variation in yield between farms and between fields is going from 6 to 16 tons per hectare. So a huge variation in yield. Nitrogen has, as I said earlier, a much bigger effect on grain protein. So on the right-hand graph, this is looking at the effects on grain protein. And you can see that within each farm, we've got a change in grain protein of between 2 and 3% due to the application of nitrogen. So it's very useful to be able to measure this grain protein to indicate whether we're getting the optimum level of nitrogen. But just to summarize the variation in yield, this is an analysis that we've done of the variation of all factors affecting yield variation. And the influence of fertilizer and manure is, even though we've purposely been changing the fertilizer levels on these farms, is only accounting for 6% of the total variation, which is going from 6 to 16 tons per hectare. So the other factors affecting the variation are predominantly the controllable factors are the farm and the field. Of course, there's seasonal variation and there are interactions with the season, and that's creating this the impression that we have in farming that everything is out of our control. But in fact, there are things that are within our control, and those are the things that we have to focus on. So to summarize, what the nitrogen management guidelines say is to go through a process an annual nitrogen management cycle in which you make your first step is to estimate what your crop nitrogen demand is going to be. And then in spring, you have to judge what the soil nitrogen supply is going to be. You have to make some estimate according to your soil type and the form of the fertilizer that you're using about the efficiency or the recovery that it's going to achieve, and that will give you your fertilizer requirement. You then have to decide how to schedule the applications, and that will depend on a lot of factors, which I'm afraid I don't have time to go into now. But the vital step that we try to emphasize in this guide is the importance of monitoring success. And for that, we use grain protein, as I'll show you in the next section of the talk, which is all about managing errors. Now, we've had a talk already this morning about soil, and soils have memories. So they remember and they accumulate if we make mistakes. And we can't see nutrients, so we have to measure them. So the important thing is to realize that if you're applying too little and continually applying too little, then you will veer off course, and you will the errors become bigger and bigger as time goes on. And this, of course, is for nutrients that are retained by the soil, like phosphorus and potassium. This is much more important than for nutrients like nitrogen, which is commonly a lot of the available nitrogen is lost over winter in wet environments. But also you can apply too much and continue applying too much. And if you don't measure what you're doing, you can go far over to the right and perpetuate your mistakes. So the important thing is to monitor regularly, because you're bound to make mistakes. There's a whole list of reasons why we're not able to make precise judgments, and particularly due to the weather. But if we can make these measurements, then we can make corrections. So that's what I want to talk about now. So we've had a talk about, this is an example rotation going through from a cereal crop to a legume crop to a cereal crop to an oilseed crop. And I want to think about how best we monitor what is happening through that rotation. And of course, we have soil analysis, and we've heard about cation exchange capacity this morning, but and of course, the importance of measuring phosphorus and potassium and magnesium and the pH. But that just tells us about the availability of a few of the 12 nutrients. What we are now realizing is the vital importance of measuring all the nutrients and doing it at the end of the season when you know this is a full picture of what the crop has managed to achieve. And actually, it doesn't cost a lot of money to analyze the grain every year on every field. In relation to what you're spending on nutrients, this is a very small expense, and it's well worth, it's far smaller than all the uncertainties that you have in your fertilizer strategy. And of course, you can also analyze the crop as it's growing. But now I want to go through the sort of and give you impression about the reliability of these techniques. So we have soil analysis, leaf analysis, and grain analysis, and I'm going to talk about them one after the other. So I'm going to talk about soil analysis in relation to phosphorus. In the UK, I've already said we have big concerns currently about phosphorus nutrition. We have quite adequate phosphorus levels in 80% of our soils, but nevertheless, we have apparent phosphorus deficiency in 50% of our crops. So there is something going wrong with phosphorus, and at a national level, we're really concerned about this. So we have to keep it simple and not just work in milligrams per litre. So the vertical axis here is milligrams per litre of phosphorus analyzed by the Olsen method. And along the bottom, we have the recent run of years. And then I have 4 different sites where we were running experiments, and we analyzed the soil every year, and we did repeated analyses within each year. So I want you to just look at the variability. And on each of these fields, we tried to keep we did our balance calculations, and we tried to keep the amount of phosphorus applied the same as the amount of phosphorus removed. And this is what happened. So we started within what we call index 2, and generally we were successful in keeping soils within index 2. But there is a lot of variation there, as you can see. And it's the variation, if you only take one analysis every 3, 4, 5 years, that is not a lot to rely on. So we have some new advice, which is all about taking much better care with soil analysis. Certainly leave 6 months since any phosphorus was applied to allow that phosphorus to equilibrate in the soil. Secondly, keep to the same routine. So always analyze at the same points within the field, to the same depth, and use the same laboratory. But then don't just do one sample on the farm, or one sample on each field each year or something like that. It's much better to do the analyses in batches, so many fields all done at once, so that you can see any results that seem to be unreliable. And then you need to check those results against each other, against what you saw previously, and against the balance calculations that you should be doing. And if there are any results from the laboratory that seem to be wrong, you should be repeating them. So soil analysis has a lot of variability and needs to be managed very carefully. Leaf analysis. Leaf analysis is very popular in the UK. Farmers use it a lot to try and guide whether they should be spraying foliar nutrients. But we can judge leaves and the condition of leaves first of all, just by looking at them. We can tell whether there are things to worry about, nutritional symptoms to worry about. Secondly, we can look at the color of the leaf. And in fact, this is a tool that they use in India and in the Far East to judge the nitrogen nutrition of wheat in India and rice in the Philippines. But also you can, of course, analyze the 12 nutrients. And I now want to show you what happens when we analyzed the nutrients with one of our networks, one of our yield enhancement networks. So you can see the 3 primary nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium on the top left. And you can see the middle 50% of all the results. There were several hundred analyses in this data set. And you can see that nitrogen decreases as the growth stage progresses. So we go from growth stage 30 to 31 to 39 to 59. So that's going from before stem extension to after stem extension. And you can see that the concentration of nitrogen decreases a little. The concentration of phosphorus, this is in just the youngest fully expanded leaf. The phosphorus decreases by about 1/4, and potassium decreases by more than 1/2. The more minor nutrients, some of them change a little, but generally change less. So the reliability of leaf analysis is not particularly good for phosphorus and potassium, not particularly good for nitrogen. Of course, you can see major deficiencies, but it's not easy to rely on. So I now want to talk about grain analysis because, well, I think this may be new to all of you. It's new in the UK. We only started recommending grain analysis in our fertilizer advice at the beginning of last year. But we've come to realize that grain analysis is easy. If you are organized at harvest, you can just take 2 handfuls out of each trailer as it comes into the store. That sample will be, and you've put it in the green bucket there and mix it all up from one field. That will be a much better representative sample than you can ever produce from walking across the field to take soil samples or to take leaf samples. And the value of that is that it allows you to calculate accurate nutrient offtakes by multiplying the content of nutrient by the yield. It allows you to estimate fertilizer recoveries if you can take 2 measurements and do some comparisons, and it allows you to detect deficiencies. So if I just show you the sort of variation that we're finding between fields in the UK, first of all, these are levels of potash, of K2O in wheat samples that we've taken. We have a national assumption, which is 5.5 kilograms per ton, but we find huge variation going from 3 kilograms per ton to 7 kilograms per ton. So straight away, that's worth knowing in order to get your balance calculations right. For phosphorus, similarly, we have a national assumption, which is 6.5 kilograms per ton, but we see huge variation going from 4 to 8 or 9 kilograms per ton. So again, very important to know that. But then we can also use grain analysis to detect deficiencies, because people have done experiments to show that at what levels the crop must have been deficient. There are 8 of the nutrients that we can do this for. And what we've done is to look within 542 samples from last year, no, the year before last, and to see how many of those samples were deficient. And it has been amazing that only 13% of the samples taken in 2020 were not deficient in any nutrient. 35% were deficient in one nutrient, and more than half were deficient in more than one nutrient. And when we look at what the main nutrient deficiencies were, as I've already said several times, phosphorus is the most common deficiency. Nitrogen deficiency was affecting 25% of crops, and manganese deficiency affecting nearly 40% of crops. So, and other deficiencies were there as well. So, but the micronutrient deficiencies other than manganese were uncommon. So, what I'd like to do now is summarize. So, we need to think of nutrition as building the canopy that does what we are in business to do, which is to harvest energy. So we're building investing in a canopy that that will intercept solar radiation, and we'll be able to sell the grain in order to make a profit. The investment in 1 hectare of green tissues, I estimate at the moment, is costs about 120 euros. And depending on what crop you're growing, you'll need to, and what the prices are doing, you'll need to grow about a canopy of 5 or 6 hectares per hectare. So that's the investment, and the return is, you need to optimize all those nutrients to make sure none of them are deficient in order to get the maximum benefit from your nutrition. It's important to do balance calculations, particularly for the major nutrients, but you can actually do it for all the nutrients. I'm always amazed how farmers apply quantities of micronutrients that are very small compared with the crop's requirements. It's important to think about variability. And the most valuable variation, of course, is at the largest scale. And the least valuable is at the sub-field scale. So you need to get it right at the farm level and at the field level before you get it right at the sub-field level. So I would beseech you all to think about monitoring the success of each farm, on each of your farms, on each of your fields, and to benchmark your results against each other. And that's what I'm going to talk about in my next talk. So the summary is, use the national information that comes from the scientists and the agronomists who do all the experiments, but then analyze but don't regard that as right for your farm, because your farm will be different from most other farms. So you need to do your soil analysis, but don't regard that as perfect. It will be imprecise, so you'll need to do it carefully. Leaf analysis will be a help. Grain analysis, I think, is the ultimate barometer of your success. So you need to use grain analysis, and then to know whether your farm is different from each other farm, you need to compare it with other farms. So you need to join a network that allows you to compare your results. So thank you very much, and I hope that I haven't spoken for too long.
Ačiū gerbiamam profesoriui už labai įdomią informaciją, lekciją, ir mes turime keletą klausimų. Komentaras. Jūs paminėjote, kad dirvožemio mikroorganizmai...
Thank you very much. You mentioned that some microorganisms of soil use a part of nitrogen. Have you estimated the true capacity of organic nutrients for crops?
Shall I stop sharing my screen? The question is, I'm sorry, but I didn't understand the question.
You
mentioned, when you spoke about nitrogen, you mentioned that soil's microorganisms use part of the nitrogen or lock it, and you said it as a negative impact. And the listener has asked whether you have truly assessed the positive effect of microorganisms for crops.
Well, of course, the microorganisms are beneficial as well. You know, there is a huge population with huge diversity within each soil. There are fungi, there are bacteria, there are arthropods, there are all sorts of different organisms with all sorts of different functions and all sorts of different life cycles. And some of the effects of those are positive and some of the effects of those are negative. And I just identified one negative process that the soil biology is responsible for, because it locks up our fertilizer just after we've applied it. But of course, the organisms will then use that nitrogen, and then some of them will die and some of them will eat each other, and the nitrogen will become released again. Unfortunately, in Northwest Europe, the release of that nitrogen generally happens in the autumn. So we have to manage to capture that nitrogen as carefully as we can. So, for instance, oilseed rape, Sarah Kendall's going to talk about oilseed rape in a minute. That is very good at capturing that autumn nitrogen that is released, but cereals are less good at capturing it. So there is a danger that the nitrogen will be lost in drainage water.
Dėkui. Kitas klausimas. Kiek manote...
Another question. What do you think? How much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium can be forwarded to crops via leaf? 20 or 30%, and the rest part comes from the soil. Is it true?
Yes, the proportion of the nutrients in the canopy that come from the soil is small for nitrogen, and then it's the majority for most of the other nutrients. So the soil is very important in providing nutrients to form the canopy. Does that answer that question?
Klausimas, jeigu patikslinsiu.
I will ask it. What do you think? What is the percentage of the nitrogen or phosphorus which can be forwarded via the canopy in percentage?
Which can be provided as a foliar spray? Is that the question? Yes. Okay. Very small. I think foliar sprays are unfortunately not well researched and not well optimized. The majority of the nutrients that the canopy needs with present technology seems to have to come through the soil. So by applying fertilizers to the soil, it is possible to apply nitrogen as a foliar spray, and we've tried to do experiments so that most of it might come from the foliar spray, but the foliar sprays are rarely more efficient than soil applications, and very often they are much less efficient than soil applications. We really need, I mean, if I can transfer the question to phosphorus, we urgently need to find ways of feeding the crop without having to fertilize the soil with phosphorus, because the soil locks up phosphorus, and then the phosphorus becomes a pollutant for watercourses and so on. So it would be excellent if we could find some technology that actually provided most of the nutrition via a direct application to the leaves.
Dar vienas klausimas tada apie fosforą.
Another question about phosphorus. Is it more effective to use phosphorus fertilizers in autumn or in the next season for the winter crops?
Well, the existing advice in the UK is to keep the level of available phosphorus in the soil high enough so that no new application, it doesn't really matter when you apply it. However, that is we have in the last 10 years been doing a lot of work on phosphorus and find that policy is very inefficient. And I don't really know the right answer to how to fertilize with phosphorus efficiently, and that needs urgent research. But what we have found is that when you apply phosphorus in the autumn as triple superphosphate, then only 4% of that phosphorus gets into the crop that then is about to grow. So it's 96% is staying in the soil and building the soil levels up. But of course, most of it is unavailable because it gets fixed.
Dar vienas klausimas.
Another question. There is a trend to use the phosphate fertilizers with additives in order to optimize the nutrition of crops and minimize the fertilizers waste, what do you think about the effectiveness of this method to use additives?
Well, I don't want to say they're a waste of time, and I would like to applaud the people who are trying to develop these products, because they are very much what we need. But in our experiments, when we have tried using some of these products, we have not been particularly impressed by their effects. They don't seem to work a lot better than our standard product, which is triple superphosphate. The best product that we find was struvite, which is a byproduct of the sewage treatment. Struvite is not water soluble. Its phosphorus is released very slowly. And I think this means that possibly one of the techniques that we need to look at is very slow release of phosphorus, rather than applying triple superphosphate, which is 70% water soluble. But also we need to look at other techniques. I'm not a soil chemist, but if we can increase acidity in the region of the root and in the region of the phosphorus granule, then I think we will inhibit the fixation of the phosphorus until the crop can get hold of it. So, for instance, diammonium phosphate, I think, will produce better responses than triple superphosphate.
Dėkui už atsakymus. Turime daugiau.
Thank you for your answers. We still have some questions, but they will be answered a little bit later. Thank you, Professor. We will meet you later.
Yeah.
And now we will have a 15-minute break. Thank you.
Sveiki sugrįžę vėl į konferenciją. Ir dabar...
Welcome back to our conference. And I'm now giving the floor to Dr. Sarah Kendall, crop physiologist at LAAS, UK. She is specializing in oilseed rape. And her topic today is the optimization of winter oilseed rape fertilization. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Truputį teks palaukti.
And thanks, Remus. So I'd just like to start by introducing myself. So I'm Sarah Kendall. I work as a crop physiologist at LAAS, which is the UK's largest independent agricultural and environmental consultancy. And I'd just like to start by really saying thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. It's great to see so many people that have been able to join and listen in to what I've got to talk about. And I hope that I'm going to be able to give you an insight into how we are optimizing the use of fertilizer in winter oilseed rape crops that are grown here in the UK. So just to give a bit of an overview of what my talk's going to focus on, to start with, I'll just give a bit of detail about how, as a physiologist, I think about yield formation in oilseed rape. And this is important really because it gives a good background to the way in which we're managing nutrition in oilseed rape, with a particular focus on nitrogen. I'll then move on to talking about nitrogen requirements and the recommendations that we use here in the UK. And Roger has only obviously given a good overview into crop nutrition and how we really think about nitrogen requirements. And although his talk focused on cereals, there's many aspects that are relevant for oilseed rape. I'll then move on to talk about canopy management principles. And this is really a principle in which we base here in the UK our nitrogen rate and timing recommendations around. I'll also briefly mention late foliar N applications and also variable N applications. So we're interested in understanding the value of being more precise with our recommendations. And then finally, at the end, I'll touch on sulfur recommendations and the requirements for oilseed rape. So I wanted to start just by giving a bit of context so that you can understand how oilseed rape crops grown here in the UK perhaps compare to those crops that are grown in Lithuania. So in this chart here, you can see the average national yields for oilseed rape from the period of 2012 to 2021. And you can see that the average UK oilseed rape yield is approximately 3.2 tonnes per hectare. And I think it's important to note that we've got significant challenges with growing oilseed rape in the UK. And one of the major challenges is cabbage stem flea beetle. And this causes a problem when the crops are being established because the adult beetles cause shot holing to the cotyledons and the young leaves, but also increasingly in the spring, where we have issues with the larvae invading the petioles and the stem of the plants. And of course, oilseed rape yields are also very sensitive to the weather conditions as well. And I'll come back to explain how we think about the impact of weather on oilseed rape yields a bit later in the presentation. But hopefully that gives a bit of context for you to understand as we go through the presentation. So in terms of when we think about oilseed rape yields, we're obviously considering the number of seeds and the seed weight. And oilseed rape is a sink limited crop. And what this means is that seed number is crucial for achieving high yields. So when I go through our canopy management principles and how we consider using nitrogen as a tool for canopy management, this is all with a focus on trying to maximize the number of seeds that are set to set the crop up with a high yield potential. And so we need to think about the period in the season that's really important for oilseed rape crops in setting up that yield potential. So the number of seeds is determined by the amount of photosynthesis during a 200 to 300 degree day period after flowering. And this period usually lasts between 2 to 3 weeks. And so it's really fundamental that the crop is well set up and can really make the most of the light that's available during that period to maximize the amount of photosynthesis and therefore set a high number of seeds. So I'll just talk through this graph carefully because it is a little bit complex. So on the x-axis, we've got the number of seeds per metre square. And on the y-axis, we've got the seed weight. And then for each of these coloured lines, they represent a yield of 3 tonnes. We've got the pink line showing a yield of 4 tonnes, and then the darker line at the top representing 5 tonnes per hectare. And so this is data. The red triangles here are experimental data from commercial crops. And what this really shows is that seed number is much more important than the seed weight. And we can understand this because as you increase in yield from 3 to 5 tons, the variation in the number of seeds per metre square is what's driving that increase in yield, and we see less variation in seed weight. And what we often find is that for a yield of 5 tonnes per hectare or more, these yields often need to achieve 100,000 seeds per metre square. So where a high yield is the target, getting that number of seeds per metre square up to or over 100,000 is important. But we obviously need to think about how pods fit in here as well. And the message here is that it's a balance that's important. So in this graph, we've got the blue crosses basically represent the number of seeds per pod and the number of pods per metre square. So as we increase the number of pods per metre square, we see a reduction in the number of seeds per pod. The red line here indicates the number of seeds per metre square in response to increasing pod numbers. And what you can see here is that there is an optimum number of pods per metre square. And this optimum is between 6,000 to 7,000 pods per metre square. And what happens if you exceed this is that the number of seeds per pod starts to reduce, and overall this results in a lower number of seeds per metre square. Now, obviously, if a crop is well set up with a high number of seeds per metre square, the challenge is then that those seeds need to be well filled to really make the most of that potential. In this graph here, you can see how biomass accumulates over time with the different components of the plant shown or represented with the different colours. So we've got the leaf in green, the stem in orange, the pod wall in blue, and then the seed in black. So I've already mentioned the period in which seed number is determined following flowering. And then we've obviously got later in the season, the determination of seed size, the point at which the seeds start to accumulate biomass rapidly. And what's really important when we're thinking about seed size is that we're maximising the amount of photosynthesis again. And this is really quite reliant on keeping that canopy as green for as long as possible. And the chart on the right-hand side of the screen just shows the actual photosynthetic capability of the different parts of the plant. And you can see that actually the pods and also the stem play a significant role in this photosynthetic capacity. So the pods are able to provide a significant amount of the photosynthesis that's carried out by the plant. So it's about maximising the duration that the crop is green, and it's about maximising photosynthesis. So I've already mentioned the weather, and obviously if we're thinking about crop nutrition as a bit of a topic here, the weather has a significant part to play in that. And obviously, you know, can have a big impact on how well fertilizers that are applied are taken up by the crop. But we did a study, and this was in collaboration with BASF, where we actually tried to understand the weather factors that were associated with high yields in oilseed rape. And so we looked for associations between high UK oilseed rape yields and the weather from 1979 to 2017. And what we found were that there were a number of weather factors that were associated with high yields. And so these included a high maximum temperature in October, a dry December, a high minimum temperature in March, a sunny or dry April, and a cool, wet and dull May. And so those factors taken together explained 37% of the variation in yield. And two of the main factors that explain this variation were having a dry December, so really trying to avoid waterlogging, and this can be problematic in a significant number of crops in the UK. And also looking for those sunny, dry conditions during April. And we think that the dry conditions help to take a check on the canopy development and make sure that there isn't excessive canopy growth. And I'll now go on to really explain why that is important. So we're basing a lot of the way in which we think about nitrogen management for oilseed rape on canopy management principles. So we want to target an optimum green area index of 3.5 at flowering. And what this figure shows here is that that is the point, or that is the canopy size in which the proportion of light that is intercepted by the crop is greatest. So the canopy management principles that we work around in the UK is really focused on trying to maximize light interception of the crop. And this is important because we want to avoid canopies that are too large, which are prone to lodging. And what you can see in this picture, hopefully, is that at the base of the canopy, it's actually very dark, and the amount of light that penetrates through to the lower leaves of the canopy can be very restricted. And this obviously then restricts the amount of light that's intercepted by the crop. And also the flower layer of the crop can pose an issue because it can reflect a significant amount of the light that's available as well. So we want to minimize the risk of lodging, and we want to maximize the amount of light that gets down into the canopy. But equally, we want to avoid small canopies, such as the one shown in the picture here. You can see that the biomass of this crop is clearly suboptimal, and there is a lot of light that is not intercepted by the crop, and it's hitting the bare soil instead. So this it's not an efficient crop, and we haven't got enough canopy there to make the most of that light. So in this picture, we're showing an optimum canopy. So you can see that light can still be intercepted by the lower leaves, and that the plants have been able to produce primary and secondary branches. So it's all about trying to target the correct canopy size to make the most of the light. And Roger already summarized in his presentation, the role of the crops in converting light energy to then edible energy. So it's really thinking about how can we maximize the light that's captured. We've done a lot of work over the years on the impact of lodging on oilseed rape. And I think it's important to highlight here because this feeds into the principles in how we think about nitrogen management, because we want to avoid lodging in oilseed rape crops. So we did a number of aerial lodging surveys, and those have shown that between 27 and 35% of UK oilseed rape area was actually lodged, and this was done approximately 10 years ago. What we've also done is some artificial lodging studies where we've shown that lodging at flowering reduces yield by 46% or by 20% when the crop is lodged to 45 degrees instead of being lodged flat. And we've been able to understand through these artificial lodging studies that the number of seeds per metre square is most affected. So early lodging will affect the determination of seed number, whereas late lodging can cause pod abortion. And we also saw impacts of the lodging on the oil content of the seeds as well, with reductions of up to 4%. So it's really crucial that we minimise the amount of lodging in crops. And even we saw leaning that took place later in the season could still have significant impacts on yield. So I'm going to now move on to talking about our recommendations from a nitrogen perspective in the UK. And I'm going to start by just giving a brief overview of these recommendations, both for nitrogen and then also for phosphorus and potassium as well. So we use a series of tables in our recommendation guides, which are really monitored by AHDB, which Roger has mentioned, which is the levy board. And for oilseed rape, we have a recommendation for 30 kilograms of nitrogen to be applied in the autumn. And then the main spring dressings, and you can see the rates are shown in this table here. So we've got different SNS indexes, which represent different levels of nitrogen supply from the soil. So the recommendations range from very small amounts where the soils would be highly fertile and provide a significant amount of nitrogen through to 220 kilos of nitrogen. And these recommendations would be for a yield of 3.5 tonnes per hectare. So the main spring dressings are applied between stem extension and early flowering. And that really depends on the size of the canopy. And I'll come on to talk about that in more detail. And there's also a recommendation for additional foliar nitrogen at 40 kilos of N per hectare to be applied between mid-flowering and 2 weeks after the end of flowering. So in terms of the recommendations for phosphorus and for potash, so the real requirement, and Roger has also kind of introduced this, is that we're trying to replace offtake for seed yield, and we're trying to maintain the soil at a target indice. So these kind of replacement values that are shown in the table here are correct for a yield of 3.5 tonnes per hectare. And so farmers would adjust these amounts based on the yield that they expected to achieve. But obviously, one of the things Roger has shown is that there can be significant variation in the amount of P and K in the grain. And we see similar things in oilseed rape in that there can be a lot of variation. So getting that accurate is important. So I'll now move on to really focusing in on spring management of nitrogen for maximising yield. So this starts by optimising nitrogen rates. So I've covered the fact that we're trying to target a green air index of 3.5 at flowering to maximise the amount of light that's intercepted by the crop. And so what we need to do is understand how much nitrogen does the crop need to achieve that optimum green air index of 3.5. So each green air index unit is made up of 50 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. So a crop with a green area index requirement of 3.5 will require 175 kilos of nitrogen. So you can see on the graph here that actually the relationship between nitrogen uptake and green area index is very good, and that we get to that 3.5 green area index, and that requires 175 kilos of nitrogen. One of the other things that we do within the recommendation system is we account for increasing yields within the rates that are recommended. So there is a correlation between yield and the nitrogen fertilizer requirement. So high yielding crops do require more nitrogen. So the recommendation is that for each additional ton of yield above 3.5 tons per hectare, this requires an extra 60 kilos of fertilizer. But I think it's important to highlight that although we see this relationship, obviously, nitrogen rate isn't the main driver of the variation that we see between farms in oilseed rape yields. So here in the UK, we basically use canopy management principles to optimize nitrogen rates. So we're targeting an optimum green area index of 3.5 units. We need 50 kilos of nitrogen to make each green area index unit. And what we see, or what we assume, is that any soil and also nitrogen in the crop, so the SNS, is 100% efficient. And we then assume that fertilizer nitrogen that's applied is approximately 60% efficient. And we then apply an extra 30 kilos of nitrogen per hectare for each half ton above 3.5 tons per hectare. But obviously there can be questions about what if and when the canopy dies off over winter. And so we assume that most of the nitrogen is retaken up by the plants if the canopy dies off over winter. So if we see natural leaf death, then obviously that nitrogen is remobilized back into the plant before the leaf drops off. If the leaves are frosted leaves, then we presume that the N is mineralized and will be then available again for uptake. And based on some work done in Germany, they were able to show that for each extra kilo of nitrogen in the canopy in the autumn, that reduced the fertilizer N rate by 0.7 kilograms of N per hectare. So essentially, you can assume that 70% of the nitrogen that was available in the crop that then may have gone on to be frosted off, 70% of that nitrogen would then be available in the spring. So what this means is that actually we need to not just be measuring the size of the canopy before the crop extends in the stem in the spring, but we should also account for how much nitrogen is in the, or how big the canopy is in the autumn, to be able to account for any nitrogen that is then lost through senescence or frosting off, and account for that in our calculations for the spring. So I'm just going to talk through a couple of examples of how we calculate nitrogen inputs using that set of principles. So in this example, we've got a target of 175 kilos of nitrogen that's required to meet our 3.5 green area index. So at the end of February, we can measure the green area index. And in this example, it's a green area index of 1 which means there's 50 kilos of nitrogen that's available in the canopy to form that green area index. We've got a soil mineral N amount of 25 kilos of N. And so this gives us a shortfall of 100 kilos of N. When we then account for the 60% efficiency for fertilizer that's applied, this gives a balance of 167 kilos of N per hectare to apply. But what you can see is when you actually have a larger canopy in the spring, so in red now, we're assuming that the canopy is double the size. It's got a green area index of 2 at the end of February. So actually this crop already has 100 kilos of nitrogen in it. So this then reduces the shortfall to 50 kilos, meaning that the amount of nitrogen to apply is then 83 kilos. So the message here is accounting for the nitrogen that's in the crop already is really important. And I think with current fertilizer prices, this is as important as ever. So being able to understand how much nitrogen is in the canopy and how much nitrogen is in the soil as accurately as possible to really optimize how much fertilizer is then required will be crucial. And here in the UK, we commonly get a significant range of canopy sizes pre the crop going into stem extension. And in this slide, you can see different examples where we've got a canopy size of 0.6, then there's an example that's 0.9, a canopy that's 1.2, and then 1.8. And actually in the UK, we're seeing a significant number of growers that are moving their drilling dates earlier. So some growers are drilling now at the start of August to try and minimize the impact of cabbage stem flea beetle on establishing the crop. And what this means is that in some crops or on some farms, the canopy sizes at this point in the year are very large, and they actually, in some cases, can contain 150 kilos of nitrogen already. So there could be examples of crops that really will not need a significant amount of fertilizer applying, where the target or the likely yield to be achieved is 3.5 tons. So how should you estimate green area index? So there are a number of apps available, and perhaps you have similar technology available to you as well in Lithuania. So in the UK, many farmers use a BASF green area index tool. And essentially this will calculate the green area index from a digital photo. And that works for green area indexes up to 2.5. If the canopy looks to be larger than 2.5, then you really need to take a sample of the crop and measure the fresh weight of that sample to be able to have a more accurate understanding of what the green area index is. Or if you just want to have a kind of quicker estimate of what the green area index is, you can estimate the fraction of soil that's covered by the crop. So if it's 1/3, this would be a green area index of approximately 0.5. If it's half, this would be a green area index of approximately 1. So that can give a rough guide, but really I think there is a greater need to accurately account for nitrogen in the canopy, and now more than ever. So I'm just going to touch on now spring management for maximising yield, focusing on the timing element. And I think getting nitrogen rate right is one component, but getting the timing correct is of importance as well. So applying all the N early will often overshoot the optimum canopy size. And this is particularly true for crops with a large green air index or high yields. So, you know, what we find is that big biomass doesn't necessarily mean high yields. It's about optimizing the amount of biomass and the canopy size. It's important to apply some of the nitrogen later, but we should remember that nitrogen uptake will slow after flowering. So I've got a couple of examples here about how we would recommend in the UK tailoring nitrogen timing based on the size of the crop. So here in this example, we've got a small crop. It's got a green air index of 0.6. So we've got 30 kilos of nitrogen in the crop already. If we assume that the soil also contains 30 kilos, we need 190 kilos, therefore, for the optimum canopy. So remember that that includes taking into account 60% efficiency for the fertilizer applied. But in this case, we're actually targeting a yield of 4.5 tonnes rather than 3.5. So we're applying an extra 60 kilos to account for the increased yield. Because this crop is very small, applying nitrogen early is vital. So in this case, you can see that the recommendation is to apply 100 kilos in late February or early March, a further 90 kilos at green bud. So that would be around mid to late March or early April here. So essentially, the nitrogen that's applied for optimum canopy size is applied by early April. And then the 60 kilos that's applied then to achieve the higher yield is applied at yellow bud or early flowering. So that would be kind of the early to late April stage. However, if we move to looking at a larger crop, so this is an example where the green air index is 2. So we've already got 100 kilos of N in the crop. In this case, the soil contains 20 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, meaning that we need to apply 90 kilos for the optimum canopy. And again, we've got the extra 60 kilos for additional yield. But what you can see here is that the recommendation is that no nitrogen is applied until green bud, so that mid to late March or early April timing. So we're delaying the first application of nitrogen to really minimize the risk of the canopy being too large, to try and minimize the risk of lodging. And then again, that 60 kilos is applied at yellow bud or early flowering. And I should add here as well that obviously nitrogen rates and timings are a fundamental part of optimizing canopy size, but actually plant growth regulator products are also useful in moderating the size of the canopy. And some PGR products can have beneficial effects in terms of improving branching and improving rooting as well. So I mentioned late foliar N. So we've seen from experiments that we've done in the UK, an average yield increase from applying 40 kilos of N per hectare at the end of flowering. And this was an average yield of 0.2 tonnes per hectare. But we did see a range of yield responses from 0 to 0.4 tonnes per hectare. And what we found is that the yield increase seems to be larger when optimal amounts of soil applied N have been applied. And it's also worth pointing out that although the late foliar N can be beneficial in terms of improving yield, there are instances where we can see a reduction in oil in a consequence from that late foliar N. So the graph here shows the responses for yield to 4 different rates of foliar N that was applied. And along the x-axis, you've got different rates of soil applied N. So we've got 50, which would obviously be considerably suboptimal, 220, and then 350. And we see the yield benefit to this late foliar N appearing to be greatest with the optimal rate of soil applied N. So generally the 220 kilos of N per hectare. So I've just got 2 slides now where I just want to touch on really some of the work that we've been doing to try and understand intra-field variation in nitrogen requirement. And this has then led to work where we've tried to quantify the benefit of optimizing nitrogen rate, but looking at this in the context of variable rate. So we've been interested in the use of variable rate technologies for a number of years now. And we've used these chessboard trials, which Roger briefly mentioned earlier, to try and understand the variation. And these trials were set up, they were normally 3 to 4 hectares in size, and the farmer would apply nitrogen in 2 different directions. And this essentially created a matrix of 4 different nitrogen rates that was then replicated across the trial area. And what this meant is that we could use those 4 nitrogen rates to then calculate what the economic optimum nitrogen rate would be. So this little schematic here shows the 4 rates, and obviously we can deduce at what point it's no longer economic to continue to apply nitrogen. So what this meant was that we could build a picture across this area of how the economic optimum nitrogen rate changed as we moved around the field. And I think this is a really useful resource for then trying to look at what the benefit of variably applying nitrogen could be. So trying to optimize nitrogen rate on a much higher resolution. So we used the data from a number of chessboard trials in oilseed rape to then try and compare different scenarios. So I'll just talk through the scenarios which are on the x-axis in the graph. So the first scenario is using a flat rate. So this rate was the average N rate that's applied to winter oilseed rape in the UK. So that's BSFP. The second scenario was using the recommendation system, which we call RB209, to define a flat rate for the trial area. And then in the third example, which is the optimum N, we used our calculations of all the different optimum N rates, and we took an average of those optimum. So in the third scenario, we're still applying a flat rate of nitrogen, but this is using information that has taken into account some of the variation in the nitrogen requirement across the field. And then the fourth scenario, which is called VRN, or variable rate nitrogen, it made use of all our calculations of the economic optimum N rates across the field. And so in that case, we've got a much higher resolution of how the nitrogen would be applied, and we're really targeting the nitrogen rate to the nitrogen requirement that we've measured. And so in these graphs, we've got the impact of the different scenarios on yield, on the nitrogen rate that was applied, and on gross margin. And so what we found was that overall, across the 4 scenarios, there was no significant effect on yield. However, we did see that using the average optimum N rate yielded better than using the average amount of rate of nitrogen that's applied in the UK. And that the variable rate nitrogen scenario out-yielded the 3 other scenarios. So we saw a yield benefit from variably applying the nitrogen. What you can see when we look at the nitrogen rates is that for the optimum N and the variable rate treatments, there was a small increase in the total amount of nitrogen that was applied. And so consequently, we didn't see significant benefits in terms of gross margin. So overall, there was limited effect really on nitrogen rate across the 4 scenarios. So I think if you take this together, in our experience, we haven't seen large benefits from variably applying nitrogen. And it seems that actually trying to optimize the rate that nitrogen is applied at the field level is as beneficial. But of course, there could be environmental benefits from variably applying nitrogen rate, where perhaps the flat rate it's over applied, and so the variable rate technology may lead to a lower amount of nitrogen being applied. So in the last part of my talk, I'm just going to mention the work that we've been doing on sulfur, which is obviously very important for oilseed rape crops. And this is some of the work that was done by some of my colleagues at ADAS, and it was funded by AHDB, our levy board. And it was trying to really understand how to optimize sulfur applications. And also part of the project was to try and understand the availability of sulfur from different organic materials as well. So why is it important for us to think about sulfur? Well, the emissions of sulfur have decreased by 94% from 1970 to 2010. And we've seen a further 50% reduction from 2011 to 2020. So at the moment, we have an annual sulfur deposition of 3 to 6 kilos per hectare of sulfur. And essentially, that's the equivalent to 7 to 15 kilos per hectare of SO3. The sulfur deposition, therefore, is currently no more than 25% of the crop uptake by cereals and 10% of crop uptake by oilseed rape. And when we think about crop responses to sulfur, we obviously need to try and estimate the demand for sulfur by the crop. So how much sulfur does the crop need to take up? And we must therefore consider the sulfur supply from the environment. So we need to think about mineralization of sulfur. The atmospheric deposition, which we've already mentioned, is obviously considerably less than it was historically. And then also the leaching of sulfur as well. And this obviously can give us an understanding of whether the crop is likely to be deficient or not. So is it likely that this crop needs to have sulfur applied as fertilizer? And there's 2 main ways in which we can deliver sulfur, either through inorganic fertilizers or through organic materials. And you may see sulfur deficiency in some of the oilseed rape crops because they can have quite obvious symptoms, so yellowing of the youngest leaves. But one of the striking symptoms for sulfur deficiency in oilseed rape can be the pale flowers. There's also a loss of yield and quality without any visual symptoms. And it's important to be aware of the susceptible sites. So here in the UK, we have a matrix of risk, which I'll come on to briefly mention. But this is really focused around those sites that are susceptible, are those that have light, sandy textured soils, low organic matter soils, areas of high rainfall where there's likely to be high levels of leaching, and also areas of lower sulfur deposition. So we've done a series of experiments where we looked at sulfur responses, and out of a total of 18 sites, we saw significant yield responses at 10 of those 18 sites. And these yield increases ranged from 0.1 to a staggering 4.4 tonnes per hectare. In these experiments, we were able to calculate the economic optimum sulfur rate, and this ranged from 30 to 79 kilos of SO3. But we didn't see a relationship between the optimum sulfur rate and yield. So actually, as a consequence of this work, the sulfur recommendations were updated, and this was now a range from 50 kilos of SO3 up to 80 kilos of SO3. So I mentioned that we're using a risk matrix to try and identify the risk from sulfur deficiency. So this is based on understanding winter rainfall, and we categorize it as low, medium or high, and then understanding the different soil textures and the risk that comes with those. So all sandy soils would be classed as having a high risk of deficiency, and then more medium soils where the rainfall is low, this would be classed as an intermediate risk. And then for the heavier soils, where we've got high rainfall, this would be classed as an intermediate risk. And for the low and medium rainfall classes, the risk of the sulfur deficiency would be low. So out of the 10 sites identified at high risk within our experimental program, 9 of the 10 showed a yield response to applied sulfur. We had 3 sites identified as intermediate risk, and 1 of the 3 of those sites showed a yield response. And then we had 5 sites identified as low risk, and we didn't see a yield response on those sites. So it seems that through our experiments, we were able to validate really the matrix in terms of being a useful way of helping farmers to identify the risk of sulfur deficiency. So I'll finish by giving some conclusions. Oilseed rape is a sink limited crop, so seed number is really critical for high yields. We're using canopy management and targeting a green air index of 3.5 at flowering as a principle to try and maximize light interception. But we need to use careful N management with optimal nitrogen rates and timings to try and build the canopy. And it's really important to account for nitrogen already in the canopy by measuring its size. And I think that is something, you know, with expensive fertilizer that's as important as ever. We've seen that late foliar N applications can boost yield. There can be benefits of variable N applications, but for oilseed rape, these do seem to be modest. And then finally, we're basing our sulfur recommendations on a risk matrix, and these have recommendations of between 50 and 80 kilos of SO3. And I'll finish there, and thank you all for listening.
Ačiū labai, Sara, už įdomią prezentaciją ir noriu paklausti.
Thank you, Sarah, for this interesting presentation. I would like to ask whether you can hear the translation into English. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Now we have several questions, and I would like to ask, how do we calculate this green area index? You talked in, I think, slide 26 about it. Maybe you could repeat once again how this index is calculated.
Yeah, that's fine. So on slide 25, there is a website address there, which is totaloilseedcare.co.uk. And that is it's got a kind of a mechanism in that website where you can upload photos and that will calculate the green area index from those photos. But I recognize that that is an English site. So whether you can make the translations work and be able to use that in Lithuania is something you'd need to look at. But you can actually take a sample of the crop. So I would recommend a 1 meter by 1 meter area. And if you measure the fresh weight of the crop and then multiply it by 0.8, that will give you the green area index. Or you can, if you want to be less certain, you can also use your kind of overview of how much soil is covered by the crop and estimate what the green area index would be from that. But my recommendation is to try and be as accurate as possible, because if you do have larger canopies, they will contain a considerable amount of nitrogen. And so you really want to make the most of the nitrogen that the canopy already consists of to make sure that you're not over applying the nitrogen fertilizer.
Ačiū. Dar turime klausimą.
Thank you. We have another question. Do you think that when fertilizing rapeseed, when this index is very low, you could actually encounter large losses of nitrogen and pollute the environment as well if you over fertilize?
Yeah, so I think you need to be, if you've got a small green area index, then you need to be careful about, firstly, not overestimating the yield potential. So you don't want to be applying high rates of nitrogen where the yield potential isn't there. But I think it's a balance, and where you're applying nitrogen earlier in the season, you obviously need to be careful about the time at which you apply it to make sure that the weather conditions are going to be positive for nitrogen uptake, and that you're not going to, that there isn't going to be a lot of uptake and then you still run the risk of leaching at that time. But I think in our experience, applying a good amount of nitrogen at the first timing with smaller crops can be very beneficial in then generating a large enough canopy that then goes on to produce a good yield. So it's a balance, and we do that. The person who asked the question is right to ask about environmental impacts. So we just need to be careful that we're applying the nitrogen when the weather conditions are good for uptake. Just to add to that as well, I think the other thing to understand is the crop small and backwards? Because, for example, it was drilled late, and so it still potentially has good potential. Or is the crop small and backwards because of another factor? So has there been a lot of waterlogging that sent the crop backwards? Is considerable pest damage? So I think it's looking at the other factors that are also behind the canopy size.
Dėkui.
Thank you.
Toliau dar turime klausimą, ar
Next we have a question.
daryti tyrimai humuso pokyčių.
Did you have any tests on humus when using different rates of nitrogen for fertilizing?
Well, in all our experiments, we would have measured the amount of organic matter in the soil, but just as a background assessment, and I don't have that data to hand to comment on the kind of impact of the organic matter measurements and how that may affect interpretations for the results.
Okay. Klausimas, kiek rapsams procentaliai?
The question, how much percentage the rape requires of sulfur in autumn?
Yeah, so here in the UK, we actually tend to apply the sulfur in the spring. And so routinely, the rates of sulfur that I talked about in the presentation, so that would be spring applied sulfur. But for oilseed rape, many growers will apply organic manures or materials in the autumn that may contribute some sulfur to the crop, and others are applying micronutrient sprays or foliar applications in the autumn that would also provide a small amount of sulfur. But although we have a 30 kilo nitrogen per hectare recommendation in the autumn, we don't have a specific recommendation for sulfur at that time. And with the sulfur application in the spring, it is important that sulfur is applied relatively early in the spring. And so this is a consideration where crops are very forward and the nitrogen application may be delayed, that on some farms, they should maybe think about a separate sulfur product so that they can deliver the sulfur early enough and that they don't delay that application too much. For example, if they were using an ammonium sulfate product.
Dėkui. Dar turime klausimą, ar esate...
We also have a question. Have you made any tests on spring nitrogen application and its impact on the lodging?
Yes. So in the past, we've done a considerable amount of experiments where we've looked at 5 or 6 different nitrogen rates. And we've been able to show that over applying nitrogen, so applying too much, can increase the lodging risk. And generally what we see in the experiments is high rates of nitrogen do result in lodging in the experiments. The other thing that we also have done is when we've done the experiments looking at different timings of nitrogen, we found that if too much nitrogen is applied early, so at late February or early March, that can also increase the lodging risk, and we see lodging occurring in those treatments. Whereas when the nitrogen is delayed more, the risk of lodging is minimized.
Dėkui už atsakymą.
Thank you for the answer. The question is, did he or she understood well that during the flowering is 40 kilos per hectare nitrogen via foliar spray once or in sometimes, but that was an excerpt from your one of your slides.
Yeah, so the 40 kilos that's applied at flowering, that would be applied as a single application at flowering, or a couple of weeks after flowering. We do see that there is flexibility in when that foliar N can be applied, but generally it's as a single application, and that is in addition to the soil applied nitrogen that I talked about to optimize the canopy and also deliver for yield. So that is additional.
Dėkui.
Thank you.
Turime klausimą.
We have another question. Have you had any similar tests in natural farms or information, or for example, for strawberries, for farms growing such crops as strawberries in different types of farms?
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite follow the question. Unfortunately, I definitely can't comment on horticultural crops.
Okay, viskas gerai. Šiaip yra daugiau klausimų.
It's okay, no problem. We do have more questions, and we also said that if our listeners cannot receive answers to their questions, we'll ask lecturers to provide responses after their presentations, and because we will not have sufficient time to ask everything, and you'll be able to answer them in writing. And then another brief comment. And lecturers talked about mineral fertilizers, and I would like to comment that our conference will take place 2 days, and the first day targets the nutrition of plants, optimization of fertilization. So we don't use too many elements, especially having in mind how expensive everything's becoming. And that's a very important issue these days. And in general, in agriculture, we need to look holistically at the farm and the farmers that are trying to make the money, and also that's another important topic. And for tomorrow, we'll also have some of these questions that will be applicable for tomorrow's lectures, because some of your questions were about this organic farming and strawberry farming, etc. So let's be patient. And now I would like to thank Sarah. Now we'll have a 15-minute break, after which we'll request Professor Roger to retake the floor. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in 50 minutes.
And welcome back. I'm now giving the floor to Professor Roger Sylvester Bradley. And today's last topic is the Action Research Network in the United Kingdom. Roger, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rimas, and hello everybody again. Yes, I want to talk about action research networks. This is a relatively new initiative in the last 10 years, organized by this organization that Sarah and I work for, LAAS, which, as Sarah said, is the largest independent research and consultancy organization for agriculture in the UK. I have worked for that organization for 40 of the 50 years I've been doing in my career. And in the last 10 years, we've come to realize that the sorry, I'm just trying to find, we've come to realize that the recommendations that we develop from small experiments on research stations and on farms, but small experiments all around the country, that those recommendations are not perfectly precise, that there is a huge amount of uncertainty. So now let me move this out of the way. And I think that's better. Right. So we have started organizing what I'm calling farm action research networks. And these, at the moment, just address crop issues. So what I want to talk and the main one is called the Yield Enhancement Network, or the YEN. And the website on which you can explore the YEN is indicated on this slide. The three topics I want to talk about are the urgent challenges that we all face in farming. And then I want to say how we are organizing farm action research networks. And lastly, I want to touch on a few of the lessons that we have been learning from those networks. So to start with, let's look at the challenges. And this is, of course, to an audience anywhere in the world now is not new. That we of course need farming, which is a commercial operation, to be profitable and resilient. But as well as that, we need sustainable human nutrition. We've got an increasing population which needs more food. We've got a big carbon dioxide problem and a big climate change problem. So we are targeting low carbon industries, including agriculture. And we have committed ourselves to net zero farming in the UK in the next 20 years. We have got a big demands by the increasingly wealthy urban population for land for leisure and for nature. So we want to maintain biodiversity. We want clean water and clean air with less pollution. We have too much pollution. We have to have resilient and healthy soils. And so all these things together mean that we need to look to change farming faster even than it has changed in the last 50 years. It needs to change very fast. So, and that is a big challenge for an industry that is so complicated. So in the UK, in the last year, we have published a plan for a national food strategy. And in that strategy, we are advocating eating less meat, having less grassland, having more woodland and forests, having less drainage, so that we have more bogs, and the bogs are very good at capturing carbon. And all that together means less land for growing crops. So we need better crop yields. So the first challenge that we have addressed with our farm action research is increased productivity. And we organize this yield enhancement network. It's a network of farmers, advisors, analysts, suppliers, and scientists. And this is just one example of one of our meetings before COVID in 2019. But it involves hundreds of people, hundreds of farms, and we are all trying to work together to increase productivity of crops in the UK. And this is how we do it. So this is the lovely countryside that we farm, and the YEN is organized as a network. And the philosophy of the network is that we share our intelligence, our knowledge, our ideas, and our data, and that we learn by sharing. So the way we do that is we start with our existing knowledge. And I've already mentioned the crop growth guides, which is a good example of the way we share our understanding of how yield is formed. And the group of people there are all Sarah and my colleagues in ADAS. We have been working for many decades now to try and generate information in easily understandable forms that farmers and the rest of the industry can understand. But then when we've decided what we know dictates what we should be measuring in our fields. So the the important things to measure are dictated by what we know. So I've already spoken about solar energy. We need to measure that. And obviously yield, we need to measure that and share that information. So we do the sharing by what we call benchmarking. So this is a benchmarking diagram where the farmer's own yield, or whatever measurement it is, this is an arbitrary measure of something going from 0 to 100, and his value is 52, and he can see that his value is in the upper quartile. So it is better than the middle half of values, but less good than the maximum value. And on the same diagram, we have a benchmark value, which is generated to be compatible with a high yielding crop. So this farmer's value is better than compatible with better than the benchmark. And then when the farmer has all his measurements and understands how his measurements compared with other farms, that then encourages the production of ideas of what farmers could do better. So the sharing and developing of ideas in innovation groups, and I've spoken about farm innovation groups, is what happens next. So we share our ideas, we develop our ideas, and then if those ideas are at all uncertain, and usually they are uncertain, then the appropriate thing is to organize tests of those ideas in experiments organized by the farm innovation groups. And the ideas may be a new product, try a new product, a different rate of a product, a new practice, a new cultivation, for instance, or even a new farming system. But whatever we're doing, because we're working in such a variable environment, we need to do the tests with great care. And I've already mentioned this guide we've produced to doing crop trials, and that is available free on the web. So this is how we organize these are what we call the 4 pillars of our action research networks. And of course, the results of the tests feed back to the knowledge and improve our knowledge. And we believe that by working together with farmers, rather than working just with scientists, then if the scientists and the farmers can work together, we will make the faster progress that we need. So the benefits to farmers of joining the Yield Enhancement Network are, first of all, that they know how their crops compare with other farms. So we organize, in order to have a bit of fun, we organize a competition, and we award the highest yield and the highest percent of potential yield. We award those people gold, silver, and bronze awards. Every autumn or every winter, we organize meetings where those awards are made. But everybody in the network, not just the winners, knows how they compare with everybody else. But the second thing is we provide a large number of explanatory measurements to each of the farmers in a long report, a 24-page report. I'll show you an example in a minute, which explains why the yield was at the level that it was at. And this really provides, I think, the due recognition for all the effort that goes into a crop. Surely you deserve, in growing that crop, you deserve a thorough report on how well you actually managed and what caused the result that you got. But then lastly, as part of the, if you're a member of a farm innovation group, then you can test your ideas and work out how to farm better. So the sorts of measurements that we're taking to explain the yield are illustrated in this slide here. So we have to, these are not all necessarily easy things to measure, and the farmers help us take these measurements and the advisors help us take these measurements. So we have a soil description, which is at the moment provided by the farmer themselves, but in some countries, there are good soil descriptions and good soil maps which we could refer to. We do a soil health analysis. We analyze leaf nutrients 2 to 4 times a year. We can look on the satellite imagery to get an estimate of light capture. We can take overhead photographs to give us ear numbers. We can take a sample just before harvest so that we can look at the structure of the crop. And that's probably the most interesting part of what we're doing. Obviously, we measure the grain yield, and we do that in a reliable way with an independent witness for every yield. And then we have the agronomy records, and we can obtain the weather information from an internet database. So a lot of information is collected, and we use the soil information and the weather information to calculate the potential grain yield. And these are just some example maps on the left for a winter cereal crop, on the right for a winter oilseed crop, both with fairly low levels of available water from their soils. 160 millimeters is a modest amount of water available from the soil. And you can see the potential yields tend to be higher in the south and west and lower in the north and east. Because there is more solar radiation and there is more rainfall in the south and west. So all the members of the network who are engaged in the network receive one of these reports. So there are 24 pages, and the 6 most important measurements are reported on the front page, along with the position of them within the whole network. So this entry was 90th for tons per hectare and 78th for % of potential yield. But then there is all the other pages have a huge amount of further information about the performance of the crop. And I've just stopped this, the pages at the page that reports the grain nutrient content, because this relates to what I was talking about in my previous talk, where we find the value of grain analysis. Remus, have I nearly reached my time? No. Okay. No. So I would like to just point out that, if we have time, we could go through this report of grain nutrient concentrations, and with the orange bar showing the farmer's own value, the red bar showing the critical value, and the box and whisker diagram showing the values of all the other farms. And you can see, for instance, for phosphorus, which is second from top, the value there is low. It's below the critical value. In fact, most people are below the critical value, and this particular farm is low amongst all those low values. So phosphorus is something to be concerned about in this particular farm. But so that's just an example, but you can quickly look down and see where the orange bars are for all the other nutrients. So as a result of all these farmers engaging in the network, we now have a very valuable database from which we can study the causes of variation in yield. And this is invaluable to not only us as scientists, but also to the suppliers, to the advisors, and to the farmers themselves. And at the moment, Sarah mentioned some analysis of the oilseed database. We've been doing analyses of database for various different purposes. You can see the yields in the histogram here vary from 6 tons up to 16 tons per hectare. The average is about 10 or 11 tons per hectare. And you can see the entries marked on the map. We have entries from parts of Scandinavia, but not from Lithuania at the moment. So that the sort of information that we have in the database includes most of the factors that you would expect to explain variation in yield. So we can talk about the factors that are affecting variation in yield. But what I want to do now is to go to one of our sponsors, and this is Dr. Bob Bulmer, who retired last year from Hutchinson's, which is a crop production specialist, as it says, and they've been sponsoring the yen from the very beginning. And Bob, before he retired, told us how he valued and his organization valued their involvement in the yield enhancement network. Before they were involved, so in 2012, they had a fairly narrow focus just on the weed control, disease control, pest control, and nutrition, without much integration between each of those decisions, and with limited awareness of soils and of rooting. And they were quite happy with 11 tons per hectare as being an adequate yield. But then the new learnings from their involvement were that actually what is controlling, the factors controlling yield, it's all to do with capturing resources, the light resources, the water resources, the nutrient resources, and converting them into edible energy. The potential yields were far higher than 11 tons per hectare. There's plenty of evidence that there are factors that we can control, that farms differ enormously, but 15 tons per hectare seems to be possible almost anywhere. And big yields are tending to come from big crops, much more dense crops of cereals than we had previously understood. And that having this physiology approach provides a really good way of thinking about crop production and making all the decisions, all the many decisions that you have to make if you're an advisory organization like Hutchinson's. So since the initiation of the cereal yen in 2012, we've multiplied the yen, so we now have yens addressing barley and oats and oilseeds and pulses. We've tried to do grass, but we found measuring grass yields is very difficult. But most interestingly, we now have a specific yen about nutrition, and we just last year initiated one to do with net zero. So, and at the same time, we've got interest in the North America, so we've had new yens being set up in North America. So to conclude, yes, farming is very uncertain, but the value of the new ability to have lots of data means that we can collect that data and get to understand the controllable factors. And one of the big things we found is that farms are so different from each other. And therefore, there is big value in farms comparing themselves with their neighbors with good measurements. And that's the farm effect is over and above the effects of soil and husbandry, which we can also identify within the database. The husbandry and genotype effects tend to be fairly small. But what we can say is that we do understand now that large yields tend to come from large crops. So farmers are now, although there's more risk involved in growing a large crop because it may contract disease more easily or it may lodge more easily, nevertheless, it's possible to grow these large crops and in order to produce large yields. The farm differences we're not fully understanding yet. Certainly there seems to be some difference in the way farmers do their nutrition, and certainly there's big evidence of farms differing in the levels of grain nutrient concentrations, and especially in nitrogen. So the overall lesson we've got from these networks is that if we want to develop and encourage progress in farming faster, and more efficiently, we really need to share the data so that we have this large body of data in which we can, from which we can extract the knowledge and everybody can make better decisions into the future. So one of the difficulties we've identified is that there is nowhere to go for the trustworthy data, that the trustworthy knowledge is distributed all over the internet and not necessarily easy to find. So at the moment, we're just developing a new platform, which we're calling farmpep.net, which is planning to share and connect the information from these action research networks. And this will evolve over the next year or two. And hopefully what we'll be doing is being able to present easily answers to all the questions that, that the industry generally has about each of these big challenges that we face. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Dėkui, profesoriu. Turime keletą klausimų.
Thank you, Professor. We have several questions to you. What do you mind? What do you have in mind when you were talking about potential yield? When you showed the map, we saw very high yield comparing to the average country yield. Can you please elaborate on that?
Yes. Yes, the crop physiologists have always been very interested in what the maximum potential yield possible will be. And that generally is dictated by the amount of solar energy and the amount of water available to the crop. We assume no irrigation here. But every other aspect of the crop we regard as manageable. So the potential yield is simply the quantity of solar energy converted into edible energy at the rates, the best rates that we as physiologists have ever measured. We assume, for instance, for wheat, that the wheat can intercept 60% of the solar energy and that it can convert it at 1.4 tons of biomass per terajoule. Now, in the UK, the average number of terajoules in a year is 35. So if you intercept 60% of that, it's approximately 24 terajoules, and we can get 1.4, so that's about 30 tons of biomass. And then we assume that the best harvest index, so that's the amount of grain as a proportion of the total biomass, is 60%. And so that gives us these high yields. So we call it the yield of the perfect variety grown with inspired husbandry.
Dėkui. Kitas komentaras.
Another comment. Yen seems to be a very professional system. Do we plan anything similar, to have anything similar in Lithuania? What would you recommend for Lithuanian farmers in this occasion?
Am I right, Remus, that I'm being asked whether this would work in Lithuania?
Taip, ar Lietuvos sistema toks?
Yes. The question is maybe whether we should have a similar system in Lithuania, or should we join the already existing system in your country, for example?
Well, setting up an action research network is quite complicated because it needs it needs financial support. We would be very lucky to have very interested sponsors in the UK. If in Lithuania we could identify an appropriate sponsor or several sponsors, or if the government was interested in funding an initiative like this, then that would make it possible to have one in Lithuania. But from a scientific point of view, there is actually big value in doing this as a collective operation. So yes, we would do it with a focus around farming in Lithuania, but we'd also share the data with farmers in the UK, farmers in North America, farmers in Sweden, and so on, because we've got some interest in Sweden last year. So what I would like to do is, if you can find interested organizations to take the initiative, but you have to have some scientists who really want to work with farmers, and you have to have some farmers who are really keen to take these measurements and understand their crops more closely.
Taip, dėkui.
Thank you.
Klausimas, kiek turi būti produktyvi?
The question, how many should be the productive stems per square meter to produce 16 tons per hectare winter wheat yield?
I think I'm understanding. So what were the characteristics of the crop, or what?
Kiek produktyvių stiebų?
How many productive stems should be per square meter to generate 16 tons per hectare yield of
That's
wheat?
a very good question. And the farmer who produces these very high yields, and there is one farmer in the UK, he's called Tim Lammerman, and he has been producing these high yielding crops in every year that he has entered the Yen. He has won the gold prize for wheat, for winter barley, for oilseed rape. He's got the oilseed rape world record yield. And so it's very important. It's a very useful example. Of course, he has a very specific farm with very specific conditions. He has a soil that is highly calcareous, but it holds water very well, and it releases that water perpetually. And I talked about the continuity in my previous lecture of water supply and nutrient supply. Well, he has a soil that does that. And then when he grows his crops, he's thinking about the light conversion all the time. He chooses varieties with erect leaves so that they share the light across a large area of leaves, because that gives him more efficiency. And he has of the order of 600 or 700 fertile shoots per square meter. And generally, we find that these high yields require at least 25,000 grains per square meter. I hope that explains.
Taip, dėkui už atsakymą.
Thank you for your answer. I would like to thank you, Professor, for your presentation. It was very interesting. I want to thank all the presenters who have shared their knowledge with us. This first day of the conference is coming to an end right now. I am grateful to the presenters, to listeners, to interpreters, and the sponsors of the conference, which is the main sponsor is Wetterstadt and other companies. Also, I want to thank the information sponsors as well. Tomorrow, we will proceed with please be aware that you will have the information reference in your email, where you can view the slides of today, both in English and Lithuanian. Thank you very much, and see you tomorrow.